fall asleep to the entire story of Achilles, a hero of the Trojan War. We know him as the warrior who could not be wounded in battle, the ancient Greek whose rage brought Troy to its knees. We know his clash with Hector, their fateful duel that decided the fate of the city. We know how Odysseus, the wiliest of the Greeks, found him when he was hiding from the war. And we know the death of Achilles, the very death that made him immortal in the memory of men. But behind the legend of the invincible fighter lies a story not about strength, but about choice. The story of a boy who was given a prophecy and had to decide for himself what kind of man he would become. Tonight, you will hear a story not so much about the battles Achilles won, but about the price he paid for glory. Behind the ancient myth of Greece's greatest warrior hides a young man who began the Trojan War as a deserter, dressed by his mother in women's clothing and hidden among princesses on a distant island, running from his fate. Who was found by cunning, who chose to fight, knowing it would cost him his life, who loved deeply and lost the one closest to him, who raged against the gods and against men, who dragged the body of his enemy through the dust, not because he was cruel, but because his grief had no other voice. He was given a choice, a long life without fame, or a short life that would never be forgotten. And he chose glory, not because he was invincible, but because he understood that true immortality is not given by the gods. It is earned through suffering, through loss, through the courage to face death with open eyes. This is the full story of Achilles, a hero of the Trojan War, explained from beginning to end. Tonight, we will walk through the shadows of his destiny, from the river Styx, where his mother dipped him as an infant, to the battlefield where he became a legend. We will witness his rage, his grief, his love, and his choice. And we will discover how a mortal man, born of a goddess, chose immortality through the only means available to him, his own courage. For those who leave likes and comments on the channel, the ancient god of dreams, Morpheus, sets aside dreams from a special shining box, decorated with a green branch. These are some of the finest dreams you will have since you stopped being children. So let the night wrap around you, and let the legend of the greatest warrior of the Trojan War carry you gently into sleep. Where the sea meets the sky, where light penetrates through the depths of the water and colors everything in green-blue tones, like the color of glass that lies at the bottom and waits to be lifted, in a cave that water had carved into the rock over thousands of years. A boy was born. He did not arrive with a cry, but rather with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the sound of the surf carried from afar. And when his mother, the goddess Thetis, took him in her arms, she felt how his body, so small and light, smelled of the sea and of light, that special light that exists only at dawn, when the sun is just beginning to rise above the horizon, and the water becomes transparent as a tear. She sat on a flat stone at the entrance of the cave, and her long hair, wet and heavy, streamed down her shoulders, leaving damp traces on her skin. She looked at her son, and her heart, accustomed to the rhythm of the sea, beat steadily. But in it was that special silence that exists only in mothers when they hold their children for the first time. She looked at his face, at his small hands, which clenched into fists, as if he were already preparing for something, and at his eyes, which had not yet opened, but she knew they would be as dark as the depth of the sea from which she had come. He smelled of salt and seaweed. But in this smell there was something else, something she could not explain, but which she felt with every cell of her body. It was the smell of life, the smell of the future, the smell of what had not yet happened, but had already begun to unfold. The father of the child, King Peleus, stood at the entrance of the cave, and his face was illuminated by the same green-blue light that penetrated through the water. He was mortal, and he felt like a stranger in this world, where water and stone spoke a language he did not understand. But his heart, when he looked at his wife and son, was full of the same joy that belongs to people when they hold something infinitely precious in their hands. He wanted to come closer, wanted to touch his son, but something held him back, perhaps the presence of the goddess who was his wife, but who remained foreign to him, like the ocean he saw every day but could never fully understand. "What shall we name him?" he asked at last, and his voice sounded soft, as if he feared to break the silence that surrounded them. Thetis raised her eyes from the infant. She looked at Peleus, and in her gaze was something he could not read. She was silent for a long time, and in this silence was something of that light that filled the cave, as if she were waiting for the sea itself to give her the answer. And then she said, "Parisius. I shall call him Parisius. Icy, because he was born in this cold, in this light that never becomes warm, because his skin is as pale as the foam on the crests of the waves." She did not explain why she chose this name. Perhaps she simply felt that it must be so. And in that moment, when she spoke it, the wind that blew from the sea changed direction, and the lamp that burned at the entrance of the cave flickered for a moment, then burned again, as if the sea itself was pausing to remember this name. Thetis knew the prophecy. She knew that her son would be stronger than his father. The Moirai, the goddesses of fate, who spin the thread of every human life, or Themis, the goddess of justice, or Proteus himself, the ancient sea god who knows all that was, is, and will be. One of them had told her this. And she believed. She knew it was true. And she knew that Zeus, the king of the gods, also knew this prophecy. And Poseidon, the lord of the seas, also knew. Both wanted her. Both had their eyes on her. But when they learned of the prophecy, that a son born of her would surpass his father, they drew back. Zeus remembered how he himself had overthrown his father Cronus, and he would not take the risk. He feared that a son born of him and Thetis would do the same to him. So she was given to the mortal King Peleus, who did not even know what fate he had received along with her. Thetis looked at her hands. They were as beautiful as ever. Her figure and beauty had not suffered at all from carrying and giving birth to a child. She was still fair. She could have been the wife of any god. But she was here, in this house, with this man, and her son lay in his cradle and smiled in his sleep. And then something happened to her. She realized that her son was mortal, that one day the hour would come, and he would leave the earth, and his lot would be to wander through the kingdom of Hades, that his body, so warm now as she held him in her arms, would one day grow cold, and his eyes, so clear, would close forever. She could not accept this. Her love transformed into something stronger, into an obsession, into a desperate, almost mad determination to make him immortal at any cost. Thetis, without telling anyone, began to perform her strange rituals and manipulations over the infant. At night, when the palace of King Peleus sank into sleep, when the servants had gone to their rooms and only the wind from the sea broke the silence, she would take the infant and place him in the burning hearth in a special way. She did this in secret from her husband, because she knew he would not understand. He could not understand that the fire did not burn her son, it purified him. It burned away the mortal part, leaving only the divine. And when the flames touched the child's skin, he cried. His cries pierced the night, and the servants who heard them whispered protective charms and prayers to the gods, frightened, but no one dared to enter the queen's chambers. And she continued. She did this every night. And in their home, among the servants and household, the little boy quickly began to be called not Parisius, but by another name, Ligeron, which in Greek means whining, whimpering, because he cried so much. But Thetis did not stop her rituals, and each time after the fire procedure, she sat by the cradle and watched her son with that mixture of love and anxiety that belongs to mothers when they know what others do not. And by day, she anointed her son with ambrosia. She rubbed it into his skin, into his hair, into every fold of his small body. Ambrosia smelled of honey and light, that special light that exists only on Olympus. She would not let the child sleep during the day. She wanted him to become accustomed to this sensation, for his body to remember it. She was obsessed. She did not sleep, did not eat. She only looked at him and thought of how to make him immortal. One night, when the house was quiet and even the wind seemed to slow its breath, a fleeting, joyful thought came to Thetis, and her heart, accustomed to the steady rhythm of the sea, beat faster than ever before. She looked at her son, and in her eyes appeared not just determination, but a hope almost painful, the kind that is born from despair and which, like a light at the end of a tunnel, becomes the only point of support. She remembered there was another way, one single way, which she had heard of from the ancient gods, the only way that could make her son invulnerable, the waters of the Styx, the river that flows in the underworld, dividing the world of the living from the world of the dead, waters that have the property of making those who dip in them invulnerable to weapons. She did not wait. She did not hesitate. She took the infant in her arms and, wrapping him in warm woolen cloth that smelled of the sea and dried herbs, left the house. The boy quickly fell asleep because he was warm and comfortable, and immediately drifted off. The night was dark, but for Thetis there was no darkness. She was a daughter of the sea, and her eyes saw in the dark as well as in the day. She walked along the path that led to the mountains, and her steps were light and swift, as if she were carrying the most precious treasure that had ever existed on earth. She walked, and her heart beat in time with her steps, fast, joyful, almost exultant. She knew this would surely help. She knew the waters of the Styx would make her son immortal. She knew he would not die. She knew that her love, her desperate, mad love, would conquer death itself. Thetis walked for a long time, through forests that were as old as the gods themselves, through mountains that touched the clouds, through valleys where the wind sang songs that no one could understand. She walked, and her feet knew no weariness, because she was a goddess. But in her soul she was a mother who was ready to walk through hell to save her child. And when she finally reached the entrance to the underworld, when her feet stepped onto the path that led to the river Styx, she paused for a moment to catch her breath. The entrance to the underworld was not what one might call a door. It was a fissure in the rock, narrow, almost invisible, that went deep down into the darkness that even the thought of light could not dispel. The air here was different, heavy, damp, saturated with the smell of decaying leaves and wet stone. And the cold that rose from this fissure was not the kind of cold that fire can warm. It was the cold of eternity, the cold of death. But Thetis was not afraid of it. She stepped into the darkness. She walked along the path that wound between huge stalactites, and her footsteps echoed through the empty space, as if she were not alone. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a soft, steady sound, the sound of flowing water. It was the river Styx. She walked toward the riverbed of the realm of Hades and Persephone, and her heart beat faster and faster because she knew, just a little more, and her son would become immortal. She walked carefully, trying not to make a sound, so as not to attract the attention of Chiron, the old ferryman who ferried the souls of the dead across the river. She knew that if he saw her, if he learned that she was trying to cheat fate, he might stop her. She could not allow this to happen. She had to do this in secret. She passed by caves where water dripped from the ceiling, creating intricate patterns on the stone, past underground lakes that were so black that you could see your own reflection coming from the depths. She walked, and her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: her son. She imagined how his body would become invulnerable, how he would grow strong and mighty, how his name would live for centuries. She imagined how he would fight his enemies, and no sword would be able to wound him. She imagined how he would stand on the battlefield, surrounded by fallen enemies, and his face would be lit by the same smile that was on his face when she held him in her arms. She imagined how he would live forever, and this thought filled her with such joy that she almost forgot the cold water that had already begun to seep through her clothes. When she finally reached the Styx, she stopped. The river flowed slowly and silently, like water that no longer flows but simply exists. Its surface was black, but in the depths one could make out a faint glow. It came from the countless souls that rested at the bottom of the river, soothed by eternity. She knelt at the very edge and dipped her hand into the water. The water was colder than she could have imagined. It burned her skin, but not with fire, with that special cold that leaves no burns but penetrates to the very core, burning away what was mortal. She took the infant in her arms and looked at him. His eyes were closed. His breathing was steady. He was asleep. He did not know what his mother was about to do. He did not know that his life would change forever. Thetis unwrapped the infant. She began to immerse him in the water. First the feet, then the body, then the chest. She held his left heel in her palm, clutching it tightly, and felt the water burning away all that was mortal from his body. Her heart beat so fast that she could hear it in her ears. She felt her hands trembling from the cold and from the excitement. She smiled, and her smile was as bright as the light she saw in her soul. However, when Thetis, having made the return journey, finally arrived home and had already laid her son in his cradle, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. She unwrapped the infant and looked at his body, looked at his hands, at his legs. Everything was fine. But when she looked at his left heel, the very one she had held in her palm, she saw that the skin on the heel was different. It was visible even in the dim light of the night lamp. The water of the river Styx had not touched it. It remained as it had been, ordinary, mortal. The mother's heart tightened. She could not believe her eyes. She ran her finger over the heel, as if hoping she had been mistaken, that the water had touched it after all, that she had simply not noticed. But no, the heel remained vulnerable. "No," she whispered. "No, it cannot be." She looked at this tiny heel, which was as soft as any mortal child's, and her eyes filled with tears. She held this heel in her palm, squeezing it. She could not accept that her plan had failed, that she had not been able to make her son completely immortal. She could not accept that in this small, defenseless heel lurked death, that her son, her little Achilles, would one day die because she had not been able to make him completely invulnerable. "Achilles' heel," she whispered, and this word sounded in her mouth like a sentence. She looked at this heel and wept, and in these tears was all her pain, all her love, all her despair. But Thetis quickly pulled herself together and thought that this was not such a great misfortune, really, and that she would simply continue her fire rituals, and now, when all that remained was to fix just the heel, they would surely help. And, comforted by this thought, she lay down on her bed, without undressing, and fell asleep. That night she dreamed of her wedding. This dream often came to her, and always brought her joy, because she recalled that day with pleasure, although, it must be said, it had not passed without adventure. She dreamed of Mount Pelion, which rose to the sky like a great green whale asleep on the surface of the earth, and its slopes, covered with forests that remembered the names of ancient kings. She dreamed, too, of the wise centaur Chiron, who lived in a cave on the mountain slope and who had once said to her, "You will be happy, Thetis. Your marriage will be blessed by the gods." She had not believed him then, but now, in her dream, she saw that day as it had been, bright, full of music and laughter, full of hope that her life would finally find meaning. All the gods of Olympus gathered for the wedding. They arrived one by one, and their appearance was like a festival of light that spread across the mountain, flooding it with gold and purple. Zeus, the lord of the sky, came first, and his presence was felt in every breath of wind that touched the faces of the guests. Hera, his consort, walked beside him, and her gaze, when she looked at Thetis, was full of that special jealousy she felt for all beautiful women, but which she hid behind a smile, as one hides light behind clouds. Poseidon, with his trident in hand, looked as if he had just emerged from the sea, and his hair, wet and heavy, fell over his shoulders, leaving dark stains on his clothing. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, stood apart, and her eyes, when she looked at Thetis, were as clear as the sky she patronized. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, sat beside Thetis, and her smile was as warm as the light that emanated from her golden hair. They were all there, and they all brought gifts that were to make this day the happiest in the lives of Thetis and Peleus. Peleus stood beside her, and his face, when he looked at her, was full of that joy that belongs to people when they hold something infinitely precious in their hands. He did not know that she was a goddess, that she did not truly belong to him, that she had simply been given to him, as one gives away a thing that cannot belong to anyone. He simply looked at her and smiled, and his smile was as bright as the morning sun that rises over the sea. He gave her a wedding ring in which was set a stone that changed color depending on the light, as the sea changes color depending on the time of day. And she looked at this stone and thought that her life too would probably change, like the sea, sometimes calm and bright, sometimes stormy and dark. The gods brought gifts one by one. Chiron gave a spear made of ash wood from the peak of Pelion, which was so light that even a child could hold it, and so strong that it could pierce any armor. Poseidon gave 2 immortal horses, Xanthus and Peleus, which were so swift they could outrun the wind, and so wise they understood the language of the gods. Aphrodite, it is said, gave Thetis a golden diadem that shone so brightly that its light could be seen even on the other side of the mountain. And each gift was a symbol that this marriage was not merely a marriage of a mortal and a goddess, but a union that was to bring something great into the world. And when the feast was at its height, when music flowed like a river and nectar flowed like a river, she entered the hall. No one had invited her. She was not expected. Her presence was not foreseen in any of the plans the gods had made for this day. It was Eris, the goddess of discord, whose very name was a curse, whose presence always brought quarrels and strife. She was not beautiful, but in her eyes burned that special fire that belongs to those who hate everything that shines with joy. She stood in the doorway, and her face, when she looked at the feasting gods, was as dark as the clouds that gather before a storm. And she threw into the center of the table a golden apple, on which was scratched just one inscription: "For the fairest." The apple fell upon the table with a soft, almost imperceptible thud, but in this sound there was something that made everyone fall silent. The music ceased. The voices fell quiet. Even the wind that blew from the sea paused for a moment, as if it too wanted to see what would happen next. And three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, simultaneously reached out their hands toward the apple. Their fingers touched it at the same moment, and their eyes, when they met, were as sharp as their desire to possess this apple. "It is mine," said Hera, and her voice was as cold as the winter wind. "I am the queen of the gods. Who could be fairer than I?" "No," objected Athena, and her voice was as firm as the steel of her armor. "My beauty is the beauty of mind and strength. I am worthy of this apple." "You are both beautiful," said Aphrodite, and her voice was as soft as the whisper of the wind in the leaves. "But I am love itself. No one can compare to me." Their quarrel grew more heated with every second, and none of the gods dared to intervene, lest they incur the wrath of the one who lost. They stood around the table, and their faces were as tense as the string of a bow about to release an arrow. They looked at the apple, and in their eyes was that same fire that had burned in the eyes of Eris when she threw it. And then Zeus, who sat at the head of the table and watched this quarrel, raised his hand. His gesture was as slow as the movement of clouds, and as commanding as his voice. "I will not judge you," he said, and his voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day. "That is too dangerous. I will send you to a mortal who will settle your dispute. His name is Paris. He tends his flocks on Mount Ida. He will be your judge." At that moment Thetis woke, and when her eyes opened, she saw the light of morning penetrating through the curtains on the windows. And suddenly she felt that this dream was not merely a memory. It was a warning that fate had already begun to weave its threads, and that her son, her little one, would be at the center of this tapestry. She lay on the bed and looked at the cradle where her son slept, and her thoughts were again occupied with what she could not put into words. She rose from the bed, walked to the cradle, and adjusted the child's blanket. He was still sleeping. His breathing was as even as the breathing of the sea after a storm. She touched his cheek, and her fingers, when they touched his skin, trembled with that same pain that was in her heart. She knew that she would continue her attempts to protect him from illness, wounds, and death, especially now, when her mother's heart sensed that a mortal danger was laid out for him by the threat of fate. And she continued, with renewed strength, with new desperation, with the same mad determination that made her simultaneously the most loving and the most cruel mother in the world. Every night, when the house fell silent and the servants retired to their rooms, Thetis would again and again take the infant and go to the hearth. The fire devoured the wood, and its light, when it fell upon the child's face, was as bright as her hope. She placed him in the hearth and watched as the flames touched his skin as they burned away the mortal part from his body. And by day, she would again and again rub ambrosia into his skin, and her fingers, when they touched his body, were as warm as her love. She gave him no peace. She gave him no rest. And her rituals continued and continued. She did this in secret from her husband, because she knew he would not understand. He could not understand that the fire did not burn her son it purified him. He could not understand that the ambrosia she rubbed into his skin was not merely an ointment, but the food of the gods, which was to make him immortal. She did not speak to him of her plans, because she knew he, a mortal, could not grasp what she, a goddess, saw so clearly. He could not understand that her love was not the kind that rocks and soothes, but the kind that burns and purifies, like the fire she kindled every night. And she continued her rituals, certain that they would save him, despite the pain, despite the cries, despite everything. But deep in her soul, in those dark corners of consciousness she rarely visited, lived a question she could not silence with fire or ambrosia. A question that grew louder with each day, with each night, with each cry of her son. Why? Why was she doing all of this? Why was she tormenting him, if even after all her efforts he would still remain mortal? Why raise him, care for him, nurture him, if he would still die? If his body would one day grow cold? If his eyes would close forever? If his soul would journey to the kingdom of Hades, where there was neither light nor warmth nor hope? What was the meaning of his life, if it was finite? What was the meaning of her love, if it could not save him from death? But she continued, because she could not stop. She continued, because hope was stronger than doubt. She continued, one more night, one more attempt, one more ritual. She did not notice how her eyes grew emptier, how her hands, when she held the infant over the fire, trembled with the weariness that had already begun to seep into her soul, as water seeps into the cracks of an old ship. She did not notice that her son had stopped crying. From exhaustion he could no longer cry, because his cry, which had once been so loud, had now fallen silent, leaving behind only silence. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes was the same emptiness that was in her heart. And one night, when the house had sunk into sleep and only the wind from the sea broke the silence, Peleus woke to a sound he could not recognize. It was not crying. He had grown accustomed to crying. It was something else. It was silence. A silence deeper than any silence he had ever known. And in this silence, he heard footsteps, footsteps that were as light as the steps of a ghost, and as swift as the steps of one who is in a hurry to do something that should not be done. He rose from his bed and followed the sound of the footsteps, which, as it turned out, came from his wife's chambers. And when he finally reached the room where his son usually slept, he saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. Thetis stood by the hearth, and her face, illuminated by the flames, was as calm as the face of a goddess who knows what she is doing. In her hands was the infant. She held him over the open fire, and the flames touched his body, licking his skin like a tongue trying to consume him. The boy did not scream, did not cry. He simply lay in her hands, and his eyes looked at the fire. Peleus screamed. He rushed to Thetis, snatching the infant from her hands. And in that moment, the fire somehow stirred strangely, and the flames touched the boy's lips. They burned them, and now the infant screamed. He looked at his father, choking on his cries, and in his eyes was the same pain that was in Peleus's heart. Peleus held his son in his arms, and his hands, as he clutched him, trembled with horror and anger. He looked at the child's burned lips, at his face, which was as pale as his mother's face, and his heart, as he looked at this, was torn with pain. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Are you trying to kill him?" Thetis looked at him, and in her eyes there was neither fear nor remorse. She looked at her husband, and in her gaze was only that same calm that had been on her face when she held the infant over the fire. She did not understand that he did not understand. She did not understand that he could not understand. She simply looked at him, and in her voice, when she spoke, was that same certainty that was in her heart. "I am making him immortal," she said, and her voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day. "I am burning away all that is mortal in him. I am making him like me." Peleus looked at her, and his face, as he looked at her, was as pale as his son's face. He could not understand what she was saying. He could not understand what she was doing. He saw only the fire that touched his son, saw only the burned lips, heard only the silence that was now the only thing left of his son's cries. He looked at her, and in his eyes was not anger but horror, horror at what he had just seen, horror that his wife, whom he loved, who had always been so kind and gentle, was capable of such a thing. "He is not immortal," he said, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same firmness that was in his hands as he held his son. "He is my son. He is mortal, and you will not make him immortal, even if you torment him every night. You are only hurting him. You are hurting him, and you cannot change that." Thetis looked at him, and in her eyes was something he could not read. She looked at him, at her son, at the fire that still burned in the hearth, and suddenly she understood that he was right. She could not make her son immortal. She could not protect him from pain. She could not make him invulnerable. She looked at the child's burned lips, at his face, which was as pale as her own, and her heart tightened with pain, but she did not weep. She simply stood and looked at them, and in her gaze was that same emptiness that had been in her son's eyes when he looked at her. "You are right," she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of the wind in dry grass. "He is not immortal. He will never be immortal. But if there is no immortality for him, then what is the meaning of his life? What is the point of raising him, caring for him, nurturing him, if he will still die? I cannot look at this. I cannot watch him live only to die. And if he will die anyway, then it is better for me to consider him dead now." She took a step back, and her eyes, when they looked at them, were as empty as her heart. She no longer felt anything. She no longer felt pain, felt no love, felt no hope. She felt only emptiness, deeper than any emptiness she had ever known. "I am leaving," she said, and her voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day. "I am leaving, and I will never return. I am returning to my sisters, to my father, to the life I knew before I became a wife and mother. I will no longer try to make him immortal. I will no longer torment him. I will simply leave him. He will die, and I will not watch it." She turned and walked out of the room. She did not look back. She did not say another word. She simply left, leaving behind her husband and son, leaving behind her home, leaving behind her shattered love. She walked through the corridor of Peleus's palace, and her steps were as light as the steps of a ghost. And when she stepped outside, when she set foot on the road that led to the sea, she felt her heart, which had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the sea, begin to beat steadily and calmly. She was returning home. She was returning to her sisters, to her father, to the life she had known before she became a wife and mother. Peleus did not stop her. Thetis walked along the shore, and her feet, as they trod upon the wet sand, left behind tracks that quickly disappeared beneath the waves. She looked at the sea, which was as endless as her sorrow, and knew that she would never return. She knew that her son, her little Achilles, would grow up without her, that others would raise him, that he would never know how much she loved him. She knew that her love had been her curse, that she could not be merely a mother, because she was a goddess, and gods do not know how to love as mortals do. They love differently. They love in such a way that their love burns like fire, leaving behind only ashes. Her little son remained in his father's house. His lips were burned, and he could not touch them to his nurse's breast. He was fed through special vessels, and people, looking at his face, at his burned lips, began to call him Achilles, without lips. Those who knew the story of his birth whispered that he had been burned by fire when his mother tried to make him immortal. Peleus remained with his son, and his life became quiet and peaceful as it could be for a young man abandoned by his wife with a sick infant in his arms. He did not know that his son would become the greatest warrior of Greece, that his name would live for centuries, that his rage, his love, his death would become legend. He simply looked at his son as he slept, and thought that his life had changed forever, that his wife had left, but his son remained, and that he must raise him to be a man he could be proud of. He did not know that his son was already marked by fate, and that this fate was stronger than any love, stronger than any fire, stronger than any ambrosia. That day, when Peleus carried his son up the slopes of Mount Pelion, the air smelled of pine and wild thyme, and the sun was warm on his shoulders, and the cicadas sang so loudly that their songs seemed to fill the whole world. He walked slowly, because he did not want this moment to end. He was holding his son, who had been burned by fire, whose lips were scarred, whose mother had left him, and he was carrying him to a stranger. He was carrying him to a centaur, and even though he knew it was the right thing to do, his heart was heavy, because he knew that when he left his son behind, he would be leaving a part of himself behind too. He stopped at the entrance of the cave, which was not dark as caves usually are, but filled with light, a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the fire in the hearth and from the walls themselves, which were covered with dried herbs and leather scrolls and musical instruments that hung from hooks carved into the rock. The air inside was warm and smelled of honey and sage and something else, something that made him think of his own childhood, of summer afternoons when the world seemed simpler and time moved slower. And in the center of all this light and warmth sat Chiron, the centaur. He was not a wild creature, not one of those savage beasts who roamed the mountains and drank too much wine and fought with their own kind. He was calm and wise, with eyes that seemed to have seen everything there was to see and a voice that was gentle enough to soothe a frightened child. He rose from his seat and walked toward Peleus, or rather, he walked with his horse-like body and his human torso, moving with a strange, graceful rhythm that made him seem both ancient and young at the same time. He looked at the baby in Peleus's arms, and his face softened into something that was not quite a smile, but which was even warmer than a smile. "I will take care of him," said Chiron, and his voice was as calm as the surface of a lake on a windless day. "He will become a great warrior. He will become a legend. I will do everything I can to prepare him for his destiny." And so Peleus left his son in the cave of the centaur. He walked back down the mountain, and his footsteps were heavy, but his heart was light with the knowledge that his son was in good hands. He did not look back, because he knew that if he looked back, he would not be able to leave. And as he walked, the smell of pine and wild thyme followed him, and the sound of the cicadas grew softer and softer until it disappeared entirely. The days that followed were the happiest of young Achilles' life. He did not remember his mother, did not remember the fire, did not remember the pain. All he remembered was the cave, and the light, and the voice of the centaur, who told him stories that seemed to come from another world. He grew strong on the meat of lions and the marrow of bears, and his body became hard and fast, like a young horse that had just learned to run. He learned to ride, to hunt, to play the lyre, to heal wounds with herbs and songs. He learned that the world was full of danger, but that he was not alone, because Chiron was always there, watching over him, guiding him, teaching him. Chiron was more than a teacher. He was a father, a grandfather, a friend. He told Achilles about his ancestors, about the lineage of the Aeacidae, which stretched back to the gods themselves. He told him about his grandfather Aeacus, son of Zeus and the nymph Aegina, who had been a king on the island of Aegina, and who had been so just that even the gods respected him. He told him about his uncle Telamon, who had become king of Salamis and had fathered Ajax, the greatest warrior after Achilles himself. And he told him about his father Peleus, who had been one of the Argonauts, who had sailed with Jason to find the golden fleece, and who had proved himself worthy of a goddess. "Your family has a great history," said Chiron one evening, as they sat by the fire and the shadows danced on the walls of the cave. "Your grandfather Aeacus was so favored by the gods that Zeus himself made him a judge of the dead in the underworld. Your uncle Telamon was so strong that he could lift a stone that no other man could lift. And your father Peleus was so brave that the gods themselves chose him to marry your mother, Thetis, the sea goddess." Achilles listened, and his eyes were wide with wonder. He did not know that his family was so important. He did not know that he came from such a great line of heroes and gods. All he knew was that the stories Chiron told him made him feel proud and strong, as if he too could become a hero one day. "Tell me about the wedding," he said, his voice eager and bright. "Tell me about how my parents got married." Chiron smiled, and his eyes grew warm with the memory. It was a good memory, even though it had been tinged with something darker, something that would later cause so much trouble. But he did not tell Achilles that part. He told him only the beautiful parts, the parts that shone like gold in the sunlight. "It was a great celebration," said Chiron. "All the gods came to Mount Pelion, to my cave, to honor your father and mother. Zeus himself was there, and Hera, and Poseidon, and Athena, and Aphrodite, and all the other gods of Olympus. They brought gifts, wonderful gifts, the kind that are given only to heroes and kings. Zeus gave your mother the wings of the harpies. Hephaestus gave your father a sword of such sharpness that it could cut through iron as if it were butter. Poseidon gave you 2 horses, Peleus and Xanthus, who were as fast as the wind and as wise as the gods themselves. Hera gave your father a cloak of such beauty that it shimmered like the sea in the sunlight. Athena gave him a flute that could charm even the wild beasts. Aphrodite gave your mother a bowl that showed the image of Eros, the god of love. And I gave your father a spear, made from the ash tree that grows on the summit of Mount Pelion, a spear so light that it could be held by a child, yet so strong that it could pierce any armor." Achilles listened, and his imagination was filled with images of gods and heroes, of golden gifts and shining armor. He did not yet know that the spear Chiron had given his father would one day be his, that he would carry it to the gates of Troy, that it would become as famous as he himself would become. He only knew that his parents' wedding had been one of the greatest events in the history of the world, and that he had been born from that event, and that he had a destiny to fulfill. "But there was something else," said Chiron, and his voice grew quieter, as if he were telling a secret that should not be told. "There was a goddess who was not invited to the wedding. Her name was Eris, the goddess of discord, and she was angry that no one had thought to include her. So she came to the celebration without being seen, and she threw a golden apple onto the table, with the words, 'For the fairest,' written on it. And 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claimed the apple because each of them believed that she was the fairest. But that is a story for another night. Achilles did not understand the meaning of the apple, not yet. He was too young to see the shadow that had fallen over his parents' wedding, the shadow that would one day consume his own life. But somewhere deep inside him, in the part of his heart that was connected to the gods, he felt something, a tremor, a warning, a sense that his destiny was not as simple as he thought. He pushed the feeling away because he was young, and the summer sun was warm, and the cave was filled with light, and the voice of the centaur was like music to his ears. He grew up in that cave, and the days passed like water flowing down a gentle stream, and he learned and played and laughed and dreamed. He did not know that his mother was watching him from the sea, that she came sometimes to the shore and looked up at the mountain, and that her eyes were filled with tears, even though she could not cry. He did not know that his father often visited, that he came to see how his son was growing, and that he would stay for hours, watching him play, watching him learn, watching him become the person he was meant to be. All he knew was that he was loved, and that he was safe, and that the world was a beautiful place, full of wonders and adventures. And as the years passed, he grew from a boy into a young man, and his body became strong, and his mind became sharp, and his heart became filled with the desire for glory. He did not know that his destiny would be to die young, to fall on the battlefield, to become a legend that would be told for thousands of years. All he knew was that he wanted to be a hero, that he wanted to do great deeds, that he wanted to make his father proud, and his mother proud, and his teacher proud. And if you, dear listener, would like to learn more about the wise and gentle centaur who raised a generation of heroes, who taught Achilles and Jason and Theseus and Asclepius, and whose own story ended with tragedy and then with immortality, we invite you to listen to the story of Chiron, which is already available on our channel. You can find the link on the screen and in the description. You will hear about his life on Mount Pelion, his teachings, his love for his students, and the terrible accident that led him to give up his own immortality. It is a story of wisdom, sacrifice, and the beauty of a life well lived. But tonight, we stay here in the cave on Mount Pelion, where the young Achilles sits by the fire, his eyes shining in the golden light, his fingers playing softly on the strings of his lyre. And as he plays, the shadows dance on the walls, and the sound of his music echoes through the cave, and the world outside becomes quiet and still, as if even the gods are listening. For a moment, everything is perfect, everything is peaceful, everything is as it should be. And in his heart, Achilles feels something that he will remember for the rest of his life. A feeling of contentment, of belonging, of being exactly where he is supposed to be. He does not know that this moment is precious, that it will not last forever, that one day he will leave this cave and go to war and never return. He only knows that he is happy, that he is loved, that he is alive. And for now, that is enough. The morning of the hunt began with the smell of dew on the grass and the sound of birds calling to each other from the trees that covered the slopes of Mount Pelion. The sun had just risen over the horizon, and its light was golden and warm, like honey poured over the mountains, and it made the leaves of the oak trees shine as if they were made of polished bronze. Achilles stood at the entrance of the cave, his small body trembling with excitement, his eyes wide and bright as he watched Chiron prepare for the hunt. He was 6 years old, but he was not like other 6-year-olds. His body, which had been fed on the meat of lions and the marrow of bears, was strong and quick, and his hands, which had learned to play the lyre and to heal wounds, were also ready to hold a spear. He had been waiting for this day for a long time, waiting for the moment when he would prove to Chiron that he was ready, that he was worthy of the training he had received, that he was not just a boy, but a future hero. "Today," said Chiron, and his voice was calm and gentle, like the voice of a father who is about to teach his son something important. "You will learn what it means to be a hunter. Not a hunter of animals for food, but a hunter of the wild, of the fierce, of the dangerous. There is a boar that has been terrorizing the villages at the foot of the mountain. He is old and cunning, and he has killed several men who tried to catch him. Today, you will help me hunt him." Achilles felt his heart beat faster, but he did not show fear. He stood up straight, his chin held high, and he nodded, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He did not know that this hunt would change him, that it would be the first step on a path that would lead him to glory and to death. All he knew was that he was ready, that he was strong, that he was not afraid. They walked through the forest, and the leaves rustled under their feet, and the wind whispered secrets that only the trees could understand. Chiron moved with a slow, steady rhythm, his hooves making soft sounds on the damp earth, and Achilles followed him, his steps light and quick, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the boar. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and its light filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of gold and shadow on the ground. They walked for a long time, and the forest grew denser and darker, and the sounds of birds and insects became quieter, as if even the animals knew that something was about to happen. Achilles could feel the tension in the air, could feel the presence of something wild and dangerous, and he tightened his grip on the spear that Chiron had given him. "There," whispered Chiron, and his voice was so soft that Achilles almost did not hear it. "He is close. I can smell him." Achilles looked ahead, and he saw it, a massive, dark shape moving through the underbrush, its body covered with coarse bristles, its tusks long and sharp and gleaming like ivory. The boar was old and angry, and it seemed to sense their presence, because it stopped and turned its head toward them, its small eyes glinting with rage. The boar charged without warning. It was fast, faster than Achilles had expected, and its tusks were like swords, ready to tear him apart. But Achilles did not run. He did not scream. He did not even blink. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, and he raised his spear, and he waited. He waited until the boar was almost upon him, until he could see the foam on its lips and the fire in its eyes. And then he moved, not away, but forward, toward the beast, and he thrust his spear with all his strength into the boar's chest. The boar let out a terrible cry, a sound that echoed through the forest and seemed to shake the very ground, and it stumbled and fell, its body twitching, its blood staining the earth a dark, rich red. Achilles stood over it, his hands still gripping the spear, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, and his heart beating like a drum. "It is done," said Chiron, and his voice was filled with pride, with something that was almost like joy. "You have killed it. You have done what no one else could do." Achilles looked at the boar, at its massive body lying still on the ground, and he felt a strange feeling, a mixture of triumph and sorrow, of victory and loss. He had taken a life, a wild, fierce life, and he had done it without hesitation, without fear. He had done what he was born to do. Chiron came to him, and his hand, large and gentle, rested on his shoulder. "You were born for great things," he said, and his voice was like the voice of a prophet, a voice that knew the future and spoke it without fear. "But remember this, Achilles, great deeds require great sacrifices. The path to glory is never easy, and it is never without pain. You will face many challenges, and you will lose many things. But if you remember this day, if you remember the courage you showed, you will always find the strength to continue. Achilles listened, and he did not fully understand the meaning of Chiron's words. Not yet. He was too young to understand the weight of the future, the burden of destiny. But somewhere deep inside him, in the part of his heart that was connected to the gods, he felt the truth of what Chiron had said, and he knew that these words would stay with him forever. They returned to the cave, and the sun was setting, its light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The day had been long and difficult, but Achilles felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride that he had never felt before. He had proven himself. He had shown that he was worthy of the training he had received, that he was worthy of the name that his mother had given him, that he was worthy of his destiny. And as he sat by the fire, eating the meat of the boar that he had killed, he felt a new feeling, a feeling that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The feeling that he had taken the first step on a journey that would lead him to greatness, to glory, to immortality. And somewhere deep in his heart, he remembered the words of Chiron, words that would guide him through the darkest moments of his life. Great deeds require great sacrifices. It was not a day marked by thunder or the trembling of the earth. It was a quiet day, the kind of day that seems ordinary, as if the world itself has no idea that something important is about to happen. The sun hung low over the mountains, and the shadows of the oaks stretched long and thin across the grass, like fingers reaching for something they could never touch. And then the stranger came, walking up the path toward the house of Peleus. He was old, very old, with a face weathered by years of travel and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He wore a simple tunic, and his staff tapped against the stones with a rhythm that was steady, almost hypnotic. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. His reputation went before him, like a shadow that falls across the land before the storm arrives. His name was Calchas, and he was a seer, a man who could read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the patterns of smoke. Peleus saw him from the doorway, and his heart tightened. He did not know what the seer had come to say, but he knew it would not be good news. It never was. He invited him in, offered him food and drink, but Calchas refused. He stood in the center of the room, his staff planted firmly on the floor, and his eyes, when they met Peleus's, were filled with something that was not quite pity, but which was close enough. "I have come to speak of your son," said Calchas, and his voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "The gods have spoken. They have revealed his fate to me." Peleus felt his hands grow cold. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, pushing it to the back of his mind, but now it was here, and there was no escape. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was quiet. "Your son," said Calchas, "is destined for greatness. He will become a warrior such as the world has never seen. His name will be remembered for thousands of years, long after the cities of men have crumbled to dust. He will be a legend. But there is another prophecy, one that follows the first like a shadow follows the light. He will die young. If he goes to Troy, he will not return. If he chooses to stay away, he will live a long life, but he will be forgotten. The world will not remember his name. His glory will be nothing. His deeds will vanish like footprints in the sand." Peleus stood in silence, and the words of the seer hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. He thought of his son, of the boy who had grown up in the cave of Chiron, who had learned to play the lyre and heal wounds, who had killed a boar with his own hands. He thought of the light in his eyes and the strength in his hands, and he could not imagine a world without him. "What am I to do?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "There is nothing you can do," said Calchas. "The choice is not yours to make. It is his. He must decide for himself, a long life without glory, or a short life that will never be forgotten." And with that, the seer turned and walked away, his staff tapping against the stones, his shadow growing longer and longer as the sun began to set. Peleus stood at the door and watched him go, and he felt a weight settle on his shoulders, a weight that would never leave. Far away, in the depths of the sea, Thetis felt the words of the prophecy as if they had been spoken to her directly. She was a goddess, and the sea was her home, and the waves carried whispers of every event that took place on the shores of the world. She did not need a messenger to bring her news. She knew. She had always known that her son's fate would be tied to a war, to a death that would come too soon. But now she heard the words clearly, as if Calchas himself were standing beside her. He will die young. If he goes to Troy, he will not return. She rose from her chamber of coral and pearl, and her heart, which had been calm and steady, began to beat faster. She could not let this happen. She could not watch her son walk into the arms of death. She had already lost him once, when she left him in the house of his father, when she convinced herself that he was already dead to her. But he was not dead. He was alive. He was growing. He was becoming everything she had hoped he would be. And now, when she had allowed herself to hope again, the prophecy came to tear that hope away. She looked toward the shore, toward the mountains where her son lived, and she made a decision that would change both their lives. She would not let him go to Troy. She would hide him. She would find a place where no one could find him, where no one could drag him into the war that would kill him. She would protect him, even if it meant deceiving him, even if it meant dressing him as a girl and hiding him among strangers. And so, the countdown began. The prophecy had been spoken, and the gods had set their plans in motion. The threads of fate were already being woven, and no one, not even a goddess, could stop them. All Thetis could do was try to buy time, to delay the inevitable, to hope that somehow, some way, her son might escape his destiny. But deep down, in the quietest part of her heart, she knew that it was hopeless. The prophecy would be fulfilled. Her son would choose glory, and he would die young. It was only a matter of time. And somewhere in the cave on Mount Pelion, young Achilles played his lyre, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. When Thetis told Achilles that he must disguise himself as a girl and travel to a distant island, he thought she was joking. He even laughed, that same laugh he had when he killed the boar, a laugh that said, "You are mocking me, mother. I am a warrior. I cannot wear a dress. I cannot hide. I must fight." But Thetis was not laughing. She looked at him with that same cold determination with which she had once held him over the fire, and he understood that she was not joking. She came to him that night. She did not enter the cave. She stood at the entrance, and her face was illuminated by the light of the moon, and it was as pale as her hands, which trembled as she looked at him. She told him of the prophecy. She told him of the war. She told him that if he stayed, if he went to Troy, he would die. And she told him that there was only one way to save him. He must disappear. He must become someone else. "You will do this," she said, and her voice was as even as the surface of the sea on a windless day. "You will put on women's clothing. You will go to the island of Scyros. You will live among the daughters of King Lycomedes. You will be called Pyrrha. You will behave as a girl, speak as a girl, move as a girl. No one must know who you really are, or you will die. Choose. Achilles chose the dress. He did not know that this was the beginning of the strangest adventure of his life. All he knew was that his mother, who had abandoned him when he was an infant, who had not seen him for many years, had suddenly appeared and told him that he must pretend to be a girl to save his life. He did not know whether to laugh or to cry. He decided to do neither. He simply put on the dress, braided his hair, said goodbye to Chiron, and set out for Scyros. The ship that carried him to Scyros was small and old, and it rocked violently on the waves. Achilles stood on the deck and looked at the sea, which was as endless as his sorrow. He thought of what he was leaving behind: Mount Pelion, the cave of Chiron, the smell of blood and smoke that was as familiar to him as his own breath. He thought of what lay ahead: an island he had never seen, a palace he had never known, people he had never met. He thought that he would no longer be Achilles. He would be Pyrrha. He would be a girl. He would be someone else. The island of Scyros was a beautiful place. There were many flowers, much sun, and many girls. Achilles, who was accustomed to the smell of blood and smoke, now breathed the scent of roses and lavender. He felt like a lion placed in a cage with rabbits. Everyone around him was so gentle, so fragile, so feminine. And he was big, strong, and clumsy, like a bear that had accidentally wandered into a ballet. King Lycomedes received him as a guest. He did not know that Pyrrha was not a girl. He did not know that she was a warrior. He simply saw before him a beautiful young woman who had come from afar and who needed shelter. He ordered his daughters to care for her, to teach her, to help her adapt. And the daughters of Lycomedes did so. They taught Pyrrha how to walk, how to speak, how to laugh, how to do everything that girls do. His first week on Scyros was a disaster. He did not know how to walk in a dress. He stepped on the hem, tripped, fell, and every time he fell, the princesses giggled, and he blushed like a tomato. He did not know how to speak like a girl. His voice was too deep, too rough, too warlike. The princesses whispered behind his back, "What a strange girl. She must be from some wild place. She does not know how to behave." Achilles clenched his teeth and remained silent. He could not tell them that he was not a girl. He could not tell them that he was a warrior. He simply endured. But gradually, day by day, he began to get used to it. He learned to walk without stepping on the hem. He learned to speak more softly, more lightly, more femininely. He learned to dance, to sing, to spin, to do everything that girls do. The princesses stopped laughing at him. They began to accept him as one of their own. They called him Pyrrha, and he answered to that name, although every time he heard it, his heart clenched with pain. But sometimes, when no one was watching, he would go to the window, look at the sea, and remember. He remembered Mount Pelion, the cave of Chiron, the smell of blood and smoke. He remembered his sword, which he had hidden under the bed, and his shield, which he had hidden in a chest. He remembered who he really was, and his hands, which had learned to spin, clenched into fists. He could not forget. He did not want to forget. And yet he had chosen this himself. He had himself boarded the ship that took him to Scyros. He had himself put on that dress, braided his hair, called himself Pyrrha. No one had forced him. His mother had told him, "You will die if you stay." And he had agreed. He had agreed because he was afraid of death. He had agreed because he did not want to die young. But now, looking at the sea, he was not sure he had done the right thing. He heard the wind whispering to him of the battles he was missing, of the glory slipping away from him, of the fate that awaited him beyond the horizon. He felt his hands, which had been idle for so long, begin to itch with the desire to take up a sword. He knew that he was not made for this life. for spinning, for dancing, for quiet conversations about the weather and flowers. He was made for war, but he also knew that his mother would not have hidden him without reason. He knew that the prophecy was not just words, that the gods did not joke when they spoke of death. He knew that if he returned, if he took off this dress and took up a sword, he might never see this sea, this sunset again. And this thought frightened him more than he was willing to admit. He stood at the window, and his thoughts raced like seagulls over the water. He wanted to stay. He wanted to run away. He wanted to be Pyrrha. He wanted to be Achilles. He did not know what he wanted more, and in this not knowing lay his greatest torment. But one day, when he was standing at the window looking at the sea, the door behind him opened, and Deidamia entered the room. She was the youngest daughter of King Lycomedes, and her eyes, when they met his, were as blue as the sea he saw from his window. She smiled at him, and her smile was as warm as the sunlight that streamed into the room. He did not know what to say. He did not know what to do. He simply stood and looked at her, and his heart, which was accustomed to beating in time with war, began to beat differently, quietly, steadily, calmly. "You always stand at the window," she said, and her voice was soft and gentle, like the whisper of waves. "You look at the sea as if you were waiting for something. What are you looking for?" He did not know what to answer. He could not tell her the truth. He could not tell her that he was looking for his sword, his glory, his fate. He could not tell her that he was not who he appeared to be. He simply smiled and said, "I look at the sea because it reminds me of home." She looked at him, and in her gaze was something he could not understand. She saw something that others did not see. She saw behind his disguise something greater, something he himself did not want to reveal. She did not ask questions. She simply walked up to him, stood beside him, and also looked at the sea. "I love the sea too," she said. "It is so vast, so endless. When I look at it, all my problems seem so small, so insignificant." They stood in silence, and in this silence there was something special, something that made him forget about the war, about the prophecy, about his fate, something that made him feel simply human, simply a young man standing at the window with a beautiful girl watching the sea. And when she left, when the door closed behind her, he felt his heart tighten. He understood that she had changed something in him, something he could not explain, something that made his life more full, more meaningful. And he knew that he must see her again. The days passed, and they met more and more often. They walked in the garden, and he listened as she spoke of flowers, of birds, of how the rain smells when it first begins. She told him about her sisters, about her father, about how she dreamed of seeing the world beyond this island. He listened to her, and his thoughts, which had always been occupied with war and death, began to drift in a different direction. He began to see the world through her eyes, a world where there was no war, no death, no prophecy, a world where he could simply be happy. But sometimes, when she turned away, when she did not see his face, he would feel his hands, which held flowers, clench into fists. He would hear the wind whispering to him of battles, of glory, of the fate that awaited him beyond the horizon. He knew that he could not run from his fate. He knew that one day he would have to make a choice. But he pushed these thoughts away. He wanted to enjoy this moment. He wanted to be with her. And one day, when they sat on the shore watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "I know you are not who you appear to be. I know you are hiding something. I do not know what it is, but I know it is something important. And I want you to know, whatever it is, you can tell me. I will not judge you. I will not fear you. I will love you as you are." He looked at her, and his heart beat faster than ever. He knew she was right. He knew she deserved the truth. He knew that if he did not tell her now, he would never tell her. And he decided to open up. "I am not Pyrrha," he said, and his voice was quiet but firm. "My name is Achilles. I am a warrior. I am the son of Peleus and Thetis. My mother hid me here to protect me from the war, from the prophecy that says I will die young if I go to Troy. I did not want you to know this. I did not want you to see me like this. But you deserve the truth." She looked at him, and in her eyes there was no fear, no surprise. She looked at him as if she had always known, as if she had been waiting for this moment to hear his words. She took his hands and held them. "I love you, Achilles," she said. "I love you not for who you are, but for who you are inside. You are a warrior, and I am proud of who you are. And I promise you, I will never tell anyone your secret. You will be safe. You will be mine." They embraced, and in this embrace was everything: fear, hope, love, pain. He felt her arms around him, felt her breath on his cheek, and he knew he would never forget this moment. He knew that she was his refuge, his quiet harbor, his safety. Their love grew with each day. They spent more and more time together, and he forgot about the war, about the prophecy, about his fate. He was happy. He was truly happy. And when she told him that she was expecting a child, he felt his heart fill with a joy he had never experienced before. "We will name him Neoptolemus," he said, and his voice trembled with happiness. "He will be a great warrior, like his father, and he will live a long and happy life." She smiled, and her smile was as warm as sunlight. She knew he was saying this not only for her, but also for himself. She knew he wanted to believe that his fate could be changed, and she wanted to believe with him. But even in Deidamius' embrace, even in the silence of the night, when he held her in his arms, he heard the call of war. He heard a voice whispering to him, "You were made for glory. You were made for battle. You cannot run from your fate." And he knew that one day he would have to make a choice between love and duty, between life and death, between being Pyrrha and being Achilles. But for now, he was with her, and he was happy, and that was enough. It was enough to forget about the war, forget about the prophecy, forget about his fate. For a moment, he was simply a man who loved a woman and was waiting for his child. And he knew that this moment would not last forever, but he wanted to enjoy it while it lasted. Meanwhile, far beyond the horizon, in the world Achilles tried not to think about, events were already unfolding that would change everything. Paris, the Trojan prince, had seduced and taken Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. This was not merely the abduction of a woman. It was a declaration of war against the entire Greek world. Menelaus, maddened by grief and rage, went to his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful of the Greek kings, and demanded retribution. Agamemnon, who had long awaited a reason for a great campaign, began to gather troops from all over Greece. He sent messengers to every king, reminding them of the oath they had once sworn to Tyndareus to defend the honor of Helen's chosen husband. And one by one, the kings and heroes began to gather their ships and warriors. But when the army was almost ready, when the ships lay at anchor in the harbor of Aulis, ready to sail for the shores of Troy, the seer Calchas declared the will of the gods. He said that Troy would not fall until Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, joined the battle. Without him, the campaign was doomed to failure. And when the leaders heard this prophecy, they understood that they must find Achilles wherever he might be hiding. But where was he to be found? Thetis, the sea goddess, had hidden her son well. But the gods, who had always favored the Greeks, revealed the secret to Odysseus. Athena, his patroness, whispered to him where Achilles could be found, and Odysseus, the wiliest of the Greeks, understood what he must do. He must go to Scyros and find the hero who was hiding among women. He took with him Diomedes, one of the bravest warriors, and they sailed to the island of Scyros. They knew that Achilles was somewhere there, that he lived among the daughters of King Lycomedes, but they did not know what he looked like. They needed to find a way to recognize him among the maidens. Odysseus, as always, relied on his cunning. He disguised himself as a merchant. He hired a ship, loaded it with goods, expensive fabrics, golden jewelry, exquisite ornaments, and docked at the shore of Scyros like an ordinary trader seeking customers among the noble women. He spread his wares on the square before the palace. On his blankets lay fine fabrics, gleaming golden ornaments, sparkling jewels, everything that might attract the attention of the king's daughters. But among all these tempting objects lay a gleaming sword and a heavy shield. This was the trap, and Odysseus knew it would work. The princesses came out of the palace one by one to look at the goods. They laughed, whispered among themselves, touched the fabrics, tried on the ornaments, and in their eyes sparkled the same fire that burns in the eyes of all women when they see something beautiful. They admired the jewelry, examined the fabrics, touched the gems, and only one of them, Hera, stood apart and showed no interest in the ornaments. Her gaze was fixed on something else, on the sword, on the shield, on the weapons that lay among the goods. Odysseus, who watched her more closely than the others, noticed that gaze. He saw how her eyes, when they touched the ornaments, were as calm as everyone else's, but when they touched the weapons, they kindled with that special fire that cannot be mistaken. Odysseus gave no sign. He continued to trade, continued to smile, continued to pretend he was an ordinary merchant. But deep in his heart, he already knew. He had found the one he was looking for. He approached Pyrrha and offered her a golden ring. "This is for you, my lady," he said, and his voice was as even as his gaze. "It will enhance your beauty." Pyrrha took the ring, but her gaze, as she looked at it, was empty. She did not see the ring. She saw only the sword. She saw only the shield. She saw only the weapons that reminded her of who she really was. She clutched the ring in her hand, and her fingers trembled. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quiet, almost indifferent. But Odysseus heard something else in it, something that confirmed his suspicion. He did not rush things. He waited. He knew his hour would come. He knew that at the right moment he would be able to test his suspicion. He waited until the sun had sunk below the horizon, until the princesses had gone back into the palace, and until only he and his wares remained on the square. Then he lit a torch, raised it above his head, and gave the signal. Somewhere beyond the city gates, the sound of a war trumpet rang out, loud, piercing, the kind of sound that cannot be mistaken. It was the sound of war, the sound of battle, the sound that said, "The enemy is coming." The princesses, who had just returned to the palace, heard this sound and screamed in fear. They ran like frightened birds in all directions, hiding behind columns, behind walls, behind anything that might offer some protection. But Pyrrha did not run. She froze in place, and her face, which had been so gentle and calm, suddenly changed. In it appeared something else, something that looked like rage, like readiness for battle, like the fire that had burned in her all this time. She seized the sword that lay among Odysseus's wares and assumed a fighting stance. Odysseus looked at her, and a smile appeared on his face, the kind of smile that appears on people when they know their plan has worked. He approached her, and his voice was calm as the surface of water on a windless day. "I know who you are," he said. "You are not Pyrrha. You are Achilles. You are the one I have been looking for." Achilles looked at him, and in his eyes was something he could not put into words. He did not know what to say. He did not know what to do. He knew only that his life, which he had built for so long, was crumbling like a house of cards, and his secret had been revealed. Odysseus stood before him, and his voice, as he spoke, was as calm as the surface of water on a windless day. He spoke of glory, of immortality, of how the name of Achilles would live for centuries, how it would be remembered long after the cities he would conquer had crumbled to dust. He spoke of Troy, of the great battle, of how without Achilles the Greeks could not win, and that if he refused, the war would last forever and thousands would die because he had not made his choice. He did not promise him an easy life, did not promise him a return home, did not promise him a long life. He promised him only one thing: immortality in the memory of men. "You can stay here," said Odysseus, and his voice was as even as his gaze. "You can live a long life here, on this island, with your wife and your unborn son. You can be happy, and no one will know your name. Or you can come with me to Troy. You can become the greatest warrior the world has ever seen. Your name will live for centuries. You will be immortal, but you may die beneath Troy, and you will remain forever young. Choose." Achilles stood in silence, and his thoughts, as they raced through his mind, were as swift as his heartbeat. He thought of Deidamia, of how they walked through the garden, how she laughed when he did something clumsy, how she looked at him when he played the lyre, and how her eyes shone in the light of the sunset. He thought of how she had told him she was expecting a child, and how he felt his heart fill with a joy he had never experienced before. He thought of how he would never see her again if he left, how he would never see his son, how his son would grow up without a father. He thought of how his life on this island had been quiet and peaceful, like a dream that had lasted too long. But he also thought of the prophecy, of glory, of the immortality that awaited him beyond the walls of Troy. He thought of how his mother, Thetis, had hidden him here to protect him from death, and how all this time he had been hiding like a coward, like one who fears his own fate. He thought of how he was not made for this life, for spinning and dancing, for quiet conversations about the weather and flowers. He was made for war. He was made for glory. He was made for his name to live for centuries. And he knew that if he refused, if he stayed here, he would live with that knowledge until the end of his days, and that would be worse than death. He looked at Odysseus, and in his gaze was the same resolve that was in his heart. "I will go," he said, and his voice was quiet but firm, like the voice of a man who had made his decision and would not turn back. "I will go with you to Troy. I will do what I must do." When he spoke these words, the world around him seemed to stop. The wind that blew from the sea paused for a moment, as if even it wanted to hear what Achilles would say next. And in that moment, somewhere far away, in the depths of the sea, Thetis felt her heart tighten with pain. She knew that her son had made his choice. She knew that he would die, but she also knew that his name would live forever, and in this knowledge was her only hope. Achilles turned and walked to his chambers, where Deidamia waited for him. She stood at the window, looking at the sea. She knew he had come to tell her something important, and she feared it. She did not want him to leave. She did not want him to die. She wanted him to stay with her, to raise their son together, to be happy. But she also knew that he could not stay. She knew that his fate was greater than her, greater than their love, greater than their life on this island. "You are leaving," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it was not a question. It was a statement. "I am leaving," he said, and his voice was as quiet as hers. "I must go. I must do what I must do. I cannot stay." She turned to him, and her eyes were full of tears. She was not weeping, but her eyes were wet, and in them was the same pain that was in his heart. "I know," she said. "I always knew you would leave. I knew you could not stay. I knew you belonged not to me, but to something greater. But I want you to know, I will love you always. I will wait for you. I will pray for you. And I will tell our son about you, about who you were, about how you loved me, about how you longed to see him. He will know who you are. He will know that his father was a hero." He embraced her, and in this embrace was everything: fear, hope, love, pain. He felt her arms around him, felt her breath on his cheek, and he knew he would never forget this moment. He knew that she was his refuge, his quiet harbor, his safety, but he also knew that he must leave. He knelt down and placed his hand on her belly, where their new life was growing. He felt the warmth of her body, felt her heart beating, and in this beating was all his hope, all his love, all his pain. He had not seen his son, not held him in his arms, not heard his cry. He knew only that he would live, and that his name would live in him, and that was enough to give him strength. "You will be a great warrior," he whispered to his unborn son. "You will be strong and brave. You will be a worthy son of your father. I will not be with you when you are born, but I will always be with you in your heart." He rose and kissed Demaia on the forehead, and in this kiss was farewell and hope, love and pain. He did not know if he would see her again, did not know if he would see his son. He knew only that he must go. Achilles walked out of the palace with a feeling he could not name except as liberation, because the weight that had pressed upon him all these years of pretense, when he had lived another's life and hidden from himself, suddenly vanished, and he understood that his attempt to run from fate was not merely a mistake, but a betrayal of his own nature, and that true peace comes not when you avoid what frightens you, but when you embrace your destiny wholeheartedly, even if it leads to death. He knew he was leaving Demaia and his unborn son, but for the first time in many years he felt alive, because he had ceased to be Pyrrha and had become Achilles again, and this realization, that he was finally doing what he was born to do, gave him that inner freedom he had found neither in Demaea's embrace nor in the silence of Scyros. He walked toward the ship with a light heart, because he was no longer a slave to his fear, but the master of his fate, and in this choice, made as a grown man, was his true strength, his joy in being himself. Achilles' ships arrived at dawn, and the sun, rising over the plains of Troy, melted the morning mist with gold, as if greeting the one who led 50 vessels and 2,500 warriors. The Myrmidons, the tribe that, according to legend, descended from ants and inherited their indomitable fury and persistence, followed him not as their king, but as the living embodiment of their destiny, and each of them knew. They sailed not for plunder or for Agamemnon's glory, but because their leader, the son of Peleus and the sea goddess, had decided that the time had come to become a legend. He stood on the prow of the flagship, and the wind tousled his hair, and in his hand he gripped the spear given to him by Chiron, and his heart beat in time with the strokes of the oars, because he knew these 50 ships, each with 50 warriors on board, divided into 5 companies under the command of Menestheus, Eutorus, Pisander, the elder Phoenix, and Alcimedon, were not merely a fleet, but his will, his wrath, his promise to the world that Troy would fall. He came not as a supplicant nor as an ally. He came as the one without whom, by the seer's word, victory was impossible, and his arrival beneath the walls of Troy was not merely reinforcements, but a declaration of war against fate itself. When they landed on the shore, when the soldiers of the Greek army first saw Achilles walking toward them, they immediately understood that this man was different from the others. It was not merely his height, his build, or the way he held his shield, which seemed weightless in his hand. It was something else, something that made them feel they were looking at a god who had decided to walk among them. He did not speak a word when he arrived at the camp. He did not need to. He simply stood in the center of the army and let them look at him, and in their eyes there was neither envy nor resentment, only the overwhelming feeling that they were in the presence of one who was not fully mortal. The first battle was a revelation. The Trojans, who had been gaining confidence and pushing the Greeks back to the shore, were completely unprepared for what descended upon them. Achilles moved through them like a storm, swift and unstoppable, his spear singing through the air like a bird of prey, his shield a wall that no weapon could pierce. One by one, the finest warriors of Troy fell before him, their bodies collapsing like rag dolls into the dusty earth. The Greeks, who had been losing hope, suddenly found it again. They surged forward behind him, crying out his name, cutting down enemies who only a moment before had been on the verge of victory. The Trojans, who for many months had known no fear, now began to feel it, a cold, creeping terror that spread through their ranks like a disease. They could not stop him. They could not even slow him down. He was not a man, but a force of nature, a forest fire consuming dry wood, and all they could do was flee. Achilles did not pursue them. He let them run, let them retreat to the safety of their walls, and he stood in the center of the battlefield, his chest heaving, his sword covered in the blood of his enemies, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt alive. He felt like himself. He was no longer the boy who had hidden behind a woman's name, who had danced and pretended to be someone he was not. He was Achilles. He was a warrior. He was a hero. He returned to the Greek camp that evening, and the soldiers greeted him with shouts, songs, and the kind of admiration usually reserved only for the gods. They hailed him as their savior, their champion, the one who would win the war for them. Achilles accepted their praise with a strange sense of detachment. He was grateful for it, yes, but it seemed distant, as if it were all happening to someone else. Because he knew that this was only the beginning. The Trojans would regroup. The war would continue. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that his own story would not end in victory, that his fate had already been written, like the fate of the city he had come to destroy. But that night, as he lay in his tent and listened to the distant hum of songs and celebrations from his men, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt at peace. He was home. He had found his purpose, his destiny, his reason for being. And whatever happened next, he would meet it as he had met everything else, with courage, with strength, with an unwavering faith that he was doing exactly what he was born to do. The campfires of the Greek camp burned bright and warm in the cool night air, their flames dancing like living things, casting long, flickering shadows across the rows of tents. The soldiers sang, laughed, and told stories of the day's battle, of fallen enemies and won glory. But at the center of the camp, in a tent larger than all the others, the kings and leaders of the Greek army had gathered, and in the air hung unease. For 9 days already, a plague had been ravaging the Greek camp. Men dropped dead, and no one knew why. And then Achilles, who was always ready to speak what others feared to utter, rose and demanded that an assembly be called. He said that the seer Calchas must step forward to explain the cause of the god's anger. Calchas stood, pale and trembling, and revealed the truth. Agamemnon, the supreme commander, had insulted the priest of Apollo named Chryses, who had come to ransom his daughter Chrysis. And now Apollo was avenging himself upon the Greeks with plague. The only way to appease the god was to return Chrysis to her father without ransom and to offer generous sacrifices. Agamemnon listened, and his face darkened with each word. He did not want to give up Chrysis. She was the finest of his captives. But he knew that to argue with the will of the gods was pointless. And then he rose, his voice cold and sharp as a sword's edge. Agamemnon listened, and his face darkened with each word. He did not want to give up Chrysis. She was the finest of his captives. But he knew that to argue with the will of the gods was pointless. And then he rose and said that he would return Chrysis, but not for Achilles' sake, not for this camp, only for the gods. However, he made it clear that Achilles would pay him for forcing him to yield. He demanded that Achilles give him Briseis, his beloved captive, in exchange for Chrysis, and added that he was already ready to be greatly angered by the situation. Achilles stood motionless. He heard Agamemnon's words, and in his chest a rage boiled up, hot and sharp as fire burning through his veins. His hand had already fallen upon his sword's hilt. His pride was wounded, his honor insulted. He had fought for this prize, had shed blood for this camp, and now this man, this usurper, this pretender, dared to take from him what he had earned. But in that moment, when he was already about to draw his blade, he felt a light touch, almost weightless but commanding. He turned and saw her, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, daughter of Zeus. She stood behind him, invisible to the others, and her eyes shone with the same light as the stars above the camp. She touched his golden hair and said, her voice like the rustle of wind in the leaves, "Restrain your anger, Achilles. Do not draw your sword. I was sent by Hera, who loves you both. Stop. Insult Agamemnon with words, but do not raise your hand. For I tell you, one day you will receive great honor. Soon he will come to you, humiliated and begging, and then you will be mightier than him many times over." Achilles heard her. He released his grip on the sword's hilt, and his breathing grew deeper. He looked at Agamemnon from under his brow, and though he held back from a bloody brawl, he could not restrain his anger entirely and lashed out at Agamemnon with accusations. He called him a miserable drunkard, with eyes as shameless as a dog's and a heart as cowardly as a deer's. He said that Agamemnon had never dared to go out into open battle before the army, nor to set out on an ambush with the bravest men, because to him that seemed like death. It was much easier and more profitable for him, according to Achilles, to plunder gifts throughout the wide camp of the Achaeans from those who dared to contradict him. And Achilles concluded that Agamemnon was a king, but not a protector, a devourer of his own people. He turned and walked out of the tent. The other kings were silent, their glances shifting from one to another, their faces pale and bewildered. They knew that the loss of Achilles was a catastrophe, but no one dared to stop him. Achilles walked through the camp to his ships, and his heart was heavy with anger and bitterness. He went to the shore of the sea, fell to his knees, and wept. He wept not as a warrior, but as a child who had lost everything. And in his despair, he called out to his mother, the goddess Thetis, who lived in the depths of the sea. He spoke to her as if she could hear him through the water. "Mother, you bore me into this world for a short life. Why then must I, born for martial glory, endure such humiliation? Agamemnon has taken Briseis from me, and I am shamed before all. Help me, mother. Go to Zeus, the Lord of the gods, and ask for his aid. Let him grant victory to the Trojans, so that the Greeks may understand how much they need me. Let them crawl to me on their knees and beg me to return." Thetis heard him with her mother's heart. She rose from the sea's depths, and her voice was soft and sorrowful, like the whisper of waves. "My son, I will do everything you ask. I will go to Zeus and ask him to help you. But know this, when I do this, there will be no turning back. The Greeks will suffer, and many of them will die. Are you ready to bear this burden?" Achilles raised his head, and in his eyes burned that same cold, firm resolve that had made him leave the tent. "Yes," he said, "I am ready." Thetis vanished into the sea's depths, and Achilles remained alone on the shore, gazing at the dark water that hid his mother. He knew that the course of the war would now change, and that this was his decision and his new choice. The night air was cold and clear, and the stars above him were bright and distant, like the eyes of the gods watching him, judging him, weighing his pride against his wisdom. He stood for a long moment in silence, and though he understood that his decision would have consequences, he could not even imagine the full horror of the situation into which he had plunged his comrades. But he was extremely pleased with himself, pleased that he had taken such a firm stand and pushed doubt away, and he went to his tent, leaving behind the sea and the stars. For 3 days the Greek leaders argued in Agamemnon's tent, and their voices, as they discussed what to do, were full of despair and anger. They knew that without Achilles the war was lost, that the Trojans were drawing closer to the ships each day, that their hope of victory was fading like morning mist beneath the rays of the sun. And then Agamemnon, who had finally realized the depth of his error, proposed sending an embassy to Achilles to beg him to return. He promised to return Briseis, whom he had not touched, and to swear a great oath that he had never laid a hand on her. He offered rich gifts, 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 cauldrons, 12 of the finest horses, 7 captives from Lesbos, and, if Troy fell, 20 more Trojan women. He offered to make Achilles his son-in-law and give him one of his daughters in marriage. But even these promises, generous and magnanimous as they were, could not hide the fact that the embassy was a gesture of desperation from a man who had lost the confrontation but did not want to admit it. And so Odysseus, the wise and cunning king of Ithaca, Ajax, the mighty and straightforward warrior, and the elder Phoenix, who had known Achilles since childhood, set out for his tent. They walked along the shore, and the wind from the sea carried to them the smell of salt and smoke, and their steps, as they trod upon the wet sand, were as heavy as their hearts. They knew their mission was nearly hopeless, but they could not allow themselves to abandon it. When they approached Achilles' tent, he invited them inside, and they sat on the skins spread upon the ground. Patroclus served them wine and meat, and they ate and drank in silence, because the words that had to be spoken were too heavy to begin with. When they had finished, Odysseus spoke first. His voice was calm and even, like the surface of water on a windless day, but in it was the same anxiety that was in his heart. He spoke of how the Greeks needed Achilles, how the Trojans were pressing them to the sea, how Hector, the Trojan leader, was burning their ships and killing their warriors. He reminded Achilles of what his father Peleus had once told him. "The gods will make you a great warrior if you restrain your anger and remember that honor is not only victory, but also the ability to forgive." He spoke of the gifts Agamemnon offered, of the return of Perseus, of how the king was ready to admit his guilt before the entire army. Achilles listened in silence. His face showed neither anger nor joy nor sorrow. He listened, and his thoughts were occupied with what he could not put into words. When Odysseus fell silent, Achilles raised his head and looked at him. He declared that he would not return to battle until the Trojans reached his very ships. He said that his honor had been insulted, and he could not forget it, even if all the gold in the world were offered to him. He said that his anger was stronger than any gifts, and that Agamemnon must pay for his mistake, even if it cost the Greeks victory. He fell silent, and silence filled the tent. Ajax, who could no longer contain his despair, rose and spoke. His voice was rough and sharp, like the sound of breaking wood. He said that Achilles was too proud, that he had forgotten friendship and duty, that he was ready to let his comrades die because of his grievance. He said that even the dead lying on the battlefield deserved more respect than a living man who refused to fight. His words were bitter and direct, like the blow of a sword, and they made Achilles think, but he did not change his decision. Then the elder Phoenix, who had known Achilles since childhood, rose and spoke. His voice was soft and sorrowful, like the whisper of waves, and he spoke of how he had loved Achilles, how he had cared for him when he was small, how he had taught him to be strong and just. He spoke of how anger was not strength but weakness, that a true hero is not one who does not forgive, but one who can forgive, even when it hurts. He spoke of how Achilles must remember his fate, that he would die young, and that his glory would live forever, but only if he was worthy of it. He wept as he spoke these words, and his tears were as bitter as his words. Achilles listened to him, and in his heart, which had been so cold and hard, something stirred. He felt his anger beginning to weaken, but he could not yield. He could not allow himself to show weakness. He said that his decision was final, that he would not return until Hector reached his ships. He said that he would wait, and that when the Trojans began to burn his ships, he would go out and fight them, but not for Agamemnon, for his comrades, for his honor. The envoys left. Their mission had failed. Achilles would not return, and the Greeks remained without their greatest warrior. And in this knowledge was their hopelessness, their despair, their last hope that had vanished like smoke scattered by the wind. And Achilles remained in his tent, alone, and his thoughts were occupied with what he had just heard. He knew his decision was cruel, but he could not change it. His pride was his prison, and he could not break free from it. Achilles sat on his bed. He thought about Phoenix's words, about his tears, about how he had spoken of him when he was small, about how he had been taught to be strong and just. He thought about Odysseus, about his wisdom, about his words that were as sharp as his mind. He thought about Ajax, about his anger, about his despair, about how he had spoken of those dying on the battlefield while he sat in his tent. And somewhere deep within him, in that part of his heart he did not want to acknowledge, he felt his anger beginning to weaken. He felt his pride, which had been both his shield and his prison, beginning to crack like an old wall that could not withstand the pressure of water. But he could not yield. He could not allow himself to show weakness. He had to remain firm in his decision, even if it cost him everything. And he sat in his tent, his eyes closed, his breathing steady, but in his heart a storm raged that found no outlet. That night, Patroclus did not sleep. He lay on his bed, and his thoughts were occupied with what was happening on the battlefield, with how his comrades were dying, with how the Trojans were pushing the Greeks back to the very sea. He heard the cries of the wounded, the smell of smoke that reached him even through the thick walls of the tent. He felt his heart breaking with pain for those who were dying while Achilles, his closest friend, refused to fight. He could not bear to watch any longer. He had to do something. The next morning, he approached Achilles, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but in it was the same resolve that was in his heart. "I cannot sit here any longer," he said. "I cannot watch them die while you stand aside. I will go into battle. I will take your armor and lead the Myrmidons. The Trojans will see me and think it is you. They will retreat. The Greeks will gain a respite. You must allow me to do this." Achilles listened to him, and in his eyes was something he could not put into words. He knew that Patroclus was right. He knew that his inaction was cruel. But he also knew that if Patroclus went into battle wearing his armor, he would be putting himself in mortal danger. He did not want to lose his friend. "Very well," he said, and his voice was quiet, lacking the usual confidence and firmness of Achilles. "You may take my armor. You may lead the Myrmidons. But promise me this. You will drive the Trojans from the ships and return. You will not pursue them to the walls of Troy. You will not risk your life for a victory that is not worth it. You will return to the tent when you have completed your task." Patroclus nodded. He knew his task was dangerous, but he was not afraid. He began to don Achilles' armor. First the greaves, gleaming with bronze, then the breastplate, which was heavy even for its owner, but Patroclus managed. He took the shield, which reflected light like a mirror, and the helmet, which shone like a star itself. He put them on, and when he stood before Achilles, he looked like the great warrior himself. He looked like one who was born for war. When he walked out of the tent, his steps were firm and confident. He knew his path was dangerous, but he knew he must do what he must do. Patroclus ran onto the battlefield in the heavy armor, showing no sign of the effort it took to move, and the Greeks believed they were seeing Achilles again in battle and shouted loudly. And they ran after him, their steps swift, their voices loud, and in their hearts kindled the hope that this time victory would be theirs. Patroclus fought like a hero. He struck down Trojans one by one, and his spear was as swift as his breath and as precise as his strike. He drove the Trojans back from the ships, and the Greeks began to think that the war had turned in their favor, that their victory was near. But Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. He forgot that he was only to drive the Trojans from the ships and return. He saw the enemy fleeing, their ranks broken, and he could not stop. He pursued them to the walls of Troy, and his heart, as he ran, was full of pride in his warrior deeds. At the walls of Troy, Patroclus encountered Hector, and all would have been well, and one could have argued who was stronger, but the battle was unequal. Hector was not alone. Beside him stood Apollo, the god of light, who favored the Trojans. Patroclus did not see him, but he felt his presence, as one feels the approach of a storm when the air grows heavy and still. When Patroclus raised his spear to strike, Apollo stepped forward and struck him on the back. The blow was light, almost imperceptible, but it drained Patroclus of his strength. His hands, which had been so strong, grew weak, and his eyes, which had been so sharp, grew dim. Apollo knocked the helmet from his head, and it rolled across the ground. He broke his spear and tore the armor of Achilles from him, and it fell to the earth. Patroclus stood before Hector defenseless, his body exposed, and in his eyes appeared the same fear that was in the eyes of all who had faced Hector in battle. Hector raised his spear and drove it into Patroclus's body, and the Trojan warrior's blow was as swift as his anger and as precise as his hatred. Patroclus fell to the ground, and his blood mingled with the dust. He looked at Hector, and in his eyes was a pain he could not put into words. But he did not regret what he had done. He had fought for his comrades. He had fought for Achilles, and he died as a hero. Hector stood over him, his face cold. He took his new war trophy, the armor of Achilles, and put it on himself. He knew these arms would bring him glory, and he walked away, leaving Patroclus's body on the battlefield. And upon the battlefield, silence descended. Not the silence that brings peace, but the silence that brings despair. The Greeks, who had seen Patroclus fall, knew that their hope was lost. They knew that without Achilles they could not win, and they stood in silence and waited. And at the same time, they understood that there was nothing left to wait for. Achilles sat in his tent when the news of his best friend's death reached his ears, and in that moment the world, which only a moment before had been so solid and comprehensible, suddenly became fluid and unstable, like water into which a stone had been thrown, and the ripples from that fall spread wider and wider, engulfing his consciousness. And he heard the messenger's voice, but the words did not reach him, because they were like someone else's, as if they were speaking of someone else, of someone he did not know. And only when the messenger fell silent, when the silence that followed his words became so thick that it could be cut with a knife, did Achilles understand. Patroclus was no more, and this knowledge entered him like cold water that slowly fills the lungs, and he could not breathe, and he could not move, and he could not weep, because his tears were somewhere deep inside and could not break through to the surface. He rose, and his legs, which had always been so firm and confident, now felt like the legs of a man learning to walk again. And he walked out of the tent, and the sun struck his eyes, and he saw the camp, which was the same as always, but at the same time completely different, because the light that fell upon the tents and ships was somehow too bright, too insistent, as if the world was crying out to him. You are alive. You are here. You can still feel. And he walked through this light, and his steps were slow and heavy, and the soldiers who saw him lowered their heads and averted their eyes, because they knew he was walking toward the body of Patroclus, and they knew that in this moment he was ceasing to be merely a warrior and was becoming a man who had lost his best friend. When Achilles saw the body of Patroclus, he fell to his knees, and his hands, which had once held a sword and killed enemies, now touched the face of his friend, and his fingers, as they moved across the cold skin, were as gentle as sunlight that penetrates through leaves and lies upon the earth in soft patches. And he looked at Patroclus, and in his eyes was not pain, but something else, something like the silence that follows a storm, when the wind dies down and you can hear the drops of water falling from the leaves. He looked at him, and in this silence he understood that his pride, which had been his shield and his prison, had finally vanished, as mist vanishes when the sun rises above the horizon, and he felt it melting within him, leaving behind something else, something that was like light entering a dark room when a door is opened. He embraced the body of Patroclus, and in this embrace was everything he could not say in words, all his pain, all his farewell, and he whispered words that were meant only for him. And in these words there was neither anger nor hatred, only a quiet, warm promise, like the promise of rain after a drought. He said he would avenge him, but in his voice there was not that cold resolve that had been there before, but something else, something that was like a light that does not go out, like warmth that does not fade. He said this, and in his heart, which had been so cold and empty, something stirred, and he felt his anger, which had been so sharp and burning, beginning to dissolve, giving way to something else, to what was like clarity that comes after a long illness, when you finally understand that you are truly healing. He walked away, leaving his friend's body on the battlefield, and his steps were light and sure, and in his heart was a silence that was like light that penetrates through leaves, and like warmth that does not grow cold, and like a promise that will live forever. Achilles sat in his tent, and his thoughts, as they raced through his mind, were not about anger, not about revenge, but about something else, about how his life, which had been so short and so bright, and had only just begun to become understandable and therefore joyful, was already beginning to approach its end. And on that night, as he lay in the silence before battle, listening to the wind playing with the tent flap, his mother, the goddess Thetis, rose from the sea's depths and went to the house of the godsmith Hephaestus. She walked through the dark waters, and her steps were light as sunlight that penetrates through the depths of the water and lies upon the sand in golden patches. She knew her son needed her, and she knew she must do everything to help him. Hephaestus worked in his forge, and his hammer, as it fell upon the glowing metal, was like a heart beating in time with the world, like breath that does not stop even in the deepest sleep, and like light that penetrates through darkness and ignites sparks that fly throughout the workshop like stars falling from the sky. He forged armor that was to become shield and sword for one who was born for glory, and each blow of his hammer was like a word spoken by a poet creating a poem, and like a movement made by an artist creating a painting. And when Thetis entered his forge, when she asked him to help her son, he did not refuse, because he knew that Achilles was not merely a warrior, but one who was to become a legend, and that his armor must be not merely weapons, but a reflection of his soul, his fate, his purpose. He took the metal, which was as warm as sunlight, and as hard as the cliffs, and began to work, and his hands, as they touched the metal, were like the hands of an artist creating a masterpiece, and like the hands of a father holding his child, and like the hands of a friend embracing one whom he loves. He forged a helmet that shone like a star, and its crest, as it rose above it, was like light that does not fade even in the darkest night, and a breastplate that was as strong as cliffs and as smooth as water, and greaves that gleamed like water in the rays of sunset, and his hands, as they moved, were like the movement of wind that rustles leaves on trees, and like the movement of waves that roll onto the shore and retreat back into the sea. He created armor that was to become a symbol of his strength and his fate, and in every movement of his hands was the same love that was in Thetis's heart when she asked for his help, and the same pain that was in Achilles' heart when he embraced Patroclus's body. But the most wondrous was the shield. He worked on it for a long time, and his hands, as they touched the metal, were as gentle as the hands of a mother holding her child, and as strong as the hands of a father protecting his family. He depicted upon it everything that was in the world: the earth, which was as warm as his heart, and the sky, which was as infinite as his love, and the sea, which was as deep as his pain, and the stars, which were as bright as his hope. He depicted two cities, one where weddings and feasts were held, and people danced and sang, and their voices were like the sound of rain falling upon the earth, and another where judgment was passed, and people argued and proved their rightness, and their voices were like the noise of wind blowing from the sea. He depicted fields sown with grain, and harvest, and vineyards, and grazing herds. And in this depiction was all the beauty and all the difficulty of life that makes it so beautiful and so difficult. He depicted war, scenes of battle, ambushes and combats, And in this depiction was all the pain and all the fury that make war so terrible and so inevitable. He depicted a festival, dances of youths and maidens to the sound of music, and in this depiction was all the joy and all the hope that make life so bright and so warm. He depicted everything that was in the world, the cosmos, and human life, and beauty, and pain, and peace, and war, and all of this was on the shield that was to become protection for the one who was born for glory. And when the shield was ready, it shone like the sun rising above the horizon. Homer, who many years later would describe this shield in his Iliad, would say that upon it was depicted a complete model of the universe. Earth, sky, sea, sun, moon, and all the stars, and that in this depiction was all the wisdom of the world, and all the beauty of the world, and all the pain of the world. He would say that this shield was not merely a weapon but a reflection of what it means to be human, and that in this reflection was all the truth one needed to know in order to live and die with dignity. And when Thetis took these arms, when she went to her son to give them to him, her steps were as light as sunlight that penetrates through the depths of the water and lies upon the sand in golden patches, and her heart, as she carried them, was as warm as his love and as strong as his resolve. She knew that these arms would become his last protection, and that upon them would be depicted all his life, all his love, all his pain, and that he would wear them when he went to meet his fate. When the armor was ready, Thetis took it and went to her son. She entered his tent, and her steps were quiet as the whisper of waves, and her face, as she looked at him, was as calm as the surface of water on a windless day. She laid the armor before him, and he examined it and put it on. And when it touched his body, he felt his strength, whose return had been so long and so difficult, return to him, as light returns after a long night. "I am ready," he said to his mother, but also more to himself, and his voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day, and in it there was no fear, no doubt, only that silence that was like light that does not fade. Thetis looked at him. She knew he would die, but she had begun to guess that his death would not be an end, but only a beginning. And she left, leaving him in the tent, leaving him with the armor and new, fresh thoughts. He stood in the silence and thought about how his life's path had turned out to be even shorter than he had imagined, even after he had consciously chosen the path of martial glory. But Achilles was ready to meet his fate, and in this knowledge was his strength, his freedom, his immortality. They met at dawn, when the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon, and its light, as it fell upon the faces of the two men, was as soft and as warm as hands that clasp each other after a long separation. Achilles stood before Agamemnon, and in his eyes there was no longer anger, no resentment, no cold fire that had burned in them when he left his tent. There was only silence, the same silence that had been in his heart when he embraced the body of Patroclus, and the same silence that had been in his soul when he understood that his pride had been his prison, and that only he himself could open the door that led to freedom. Agamemnon stood before him, and his face was pale, like his hands, which trembled as he looked at Achilles. He knew that his words had been cruel, that his actions had been unjust, that his pride, which had been as strong as Achilles's, had brought them to this moment. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat like stones that cannot pass through a narrow passage. He simply stood and looked at Achilles, and in his eyes too was pain. "I have come to make peace with you," said Achilles, and his voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day, and in it there was no anger, no resentment, only that silence that was like light that does not fade. I have come to tell you that my pride was my prison, and that I have understood that only I myself can open the door that leads to freedom. I cannot bring Patroclus back, and I cannot change what has happened, but I can do what I must do. I can avenge him. I can kill Hector. I can do everything that needs to be done so that his death is avenged. Agamemnon looked at him. He knew that he did not deserve forgiveness, that his actions had been cruel, that his pride, which had been as strong as Achilles's, had brought them to this moment. But he also knew that Achilles was right, that his pride too had been his prison, and that only he himself could open the door that led to freedom. "I offer you my apology," said Agamemnon, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same sincerity that was in his heart. "I was wrong. I cannot give you back what I took, and I cannot change what has happened, but I can tell you that I am sorry, and that I will do everything I can to help you avenge Patroclus." Achilles looked at him. He knew that reconciliation was not an end, but a beginning, the beginning of his path to death, and at the same time the beginning of his path to immortality. He nodded, and in that nod was everything he could not say in words: his forgiveness, his acceptance, his readiness to move forward. "I am ready," he said again, now to Agamemnon as well, and his voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day, and in it there was no fear, no doubt, only that silence that was like light that does not fade. "I am ready to go into battle. I am ready to do what I must do." He entered battle at dawn, and the sun that rose above the horizon was as red as the blood that had already begun to flow on the battlefield, and as hot as the anger that burned in his heart when he thought of Patroclus, of his body lying on the ground, of his eyes that could no longer look at him, of his voice that could no longer speak his name. Achilles walked forward, and his steps were heavy and sure, and his face, as he looked at his enemies, was calm, but in his eyes burned the same fire that had burned in his soul when he learned of his friend's death. And this fire was like flame that devours dry forest, and like a storm that sweeps away everything in its path, and like light that does not fade, even when everything around is plunged into darkness. He killed all who crossed his path, and his sword was as swift as his breath, and as precise as his strike, and he did not stop, did not think, did not feel anything but that cold, firm resolve that was in his heart when he made his promise to Patroclus. He broke through the ranks of the Trojans, and his armor, which gleamed in the sun, was like stars falling from the sky, and his shield, upon which was depicted all life and all death, was like a mirror reflecting all the pain and all the beauty of the world. He was like a storm that knows no mercy, and like fire that knows no pity. And when he finally met Hector, when their gazes crossed in that raging inferno, the world seemed to pause for a moment, and everything around ceased to exist. Only he and the one who had killed his friend, only his anger and his pain, only his revenge and his fate. They stood facing each other, and the wind that blew from the sea was as cold as their hearts, and as strong as their hatred. Achilles raised his spear, and his hand, as it gripped the shaft, was firm, and in it was all his strength, all his pain, all his hatred. He threw it, and the spear as it flew through the air was like lightning that splits the sky, and like a bird that flies to its target, and like a word spoken by a poet creating a poem. It pierced Hector's body, and when he fell to the ground, his eyes, which had once been so proud and so strong, dimmed, and his breath, which had once been so steady and so calm, stopped forever. Achilles stood over him, his chest heaving, and he felt no joy, no satisfaction, no glory of which he had dreamed when he went to war. He felt only emptiness, like cold water filling the lungs, and like the silence that follows a storm, and like the darkness that descends upon the earth when the sun sets below the horizon. He tied Hector's body to his chariot, and his hands as he tightened the knots trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in him when he made his promise to Patroclus. He leaped onto the chariot, and his voice when he shouted to the horses to run was as loud as his anger and as piercing as his pain. He raced across the battlefield, dragging Hector's body behind him, and his chariot as it sped across the dusty earth left behind a long trail, like a scar left upon the body of the world. He dragged him through the dust. He took his revenge, but his revenge was bitter as wine that has stood too long in an open jar, and like a cloudy, slushy morning after a long, damp night, when you have been waiting for warmth and sun and barely made it to dawn without losing your mind. Achilles stopped only when the sun began to set below the horizon, and its light, as it fell upon the battlefield, was as red as the blood that had already begun to dry on his hands. He looked at Hector's body lying on the ground. He knew that his revenge was complete, but he felt no relief, no joy, nothing but the same emptiness that had been in him when he first learned of Patroclus's death. He knew that his victory was bitter, like death that comes to all, and like life that continues, even when you do not want to live. He climbed down from the chariot, and his steps were slow and heavy, like his thoughts, and he walked to Hector's body. He knew that his mission was complete, but he also knew that his life, which had been so short and so bright, was already beginning to approach its end. He turned and walked toward his tent. For 3 days Achilles did not sleep. For 3 days he sat by Patroclus's body, and his eyes, which had been so sharp and so strong, were now red from tears he could not stop, and his hands, which had once held a sword and killed enemies, now lay upon his friend's cold hand and would not let go. He spoke to him as if he could hear, as if his voice, when it sounded in the silence of the tent, could penetrate through that wall that separated the living from the dead. He spoke to him of their friendship, of his pain, of his revenge, of what he had done, and of what he would no longer do. He promised him that his funeral would be worthy of him, that his body would be burned on the largest pyre the world had ever seen, that his memory would live forever, that his name would sound in songs that would be sung long after they had both departed. And when the day of the funeral came, when the sun rose above the horizon, and its light was as pale as Patroclus's face, and as cold as the hands that could no longer grip a sword, Achilles left his tent and led the army to the place where the pyre was to be raised. They walked across the battlefield, and their steps were heavy and slow, like their hearts, and their faces, when they looked at Patroclus's body carried upon their shoulders, were as empty as their souls. They knew they were losing not merely a warrior, but a part of themselves, a part of their lives, a part of their hope. The pyre was huge as a mountain, and its flame, as it rose to the sky, was like light that does not fade, and like warmth that does not leave, and like life that continues, even when you do not want to live. Achilles stood before it and watched the flames. The fire rose to the sky, and he stood and watched as the fire consumed Patroclus's body, and in his eyes was the same pain that had been in his heart when he learned of his death. But now in this pain there was something new, something that was like acceptance, like surrender, like a quiet, warm understanding that life continues, even when you lose those who are dear to you. After the pyre had burned down, Achilles held games in honor of Patroclus. He offered prizes, gold, weapons, horses, and the warriors competed in running, wrestling, archery, and spear throwing. They laughed and shouted, and their voices, as they rose to the sky, were like the sound of rain falling upon the earth, and like the noise of wind blowing from the sea. Achilles watched them, and his face, as he watched the games, was as calm as his heart, which seemed finally to have found peace. When the games ended, when the last victor had received his prize, and the last warrior had returned to his tent, Achilles remained alone by the dying fire. He sat on the ground, and his hands, which had once gripped a sword and killed enemies, now rested on his knees, and he looked at the glowing embers, which still shone like stars falling from the sky. He thought of Patroclus, thought of his life, which had been so short and so bright, and of his death, which already awaited him somewhere out there, beyond the horizon. Night had fallen upon the Greek camp, and its silence, as it enveloped the tents and ships, was as deep as the sea, and as black as the charcoal left after a fire. Achilles sat in his tent, and his thoughts, as they raced through his mind, were of Patroclus, of his life, of his death, of what he had done, and of what he would no longer do. He did not sleep, because sleep, which had once been so light and so sweet, was now foreign to him, like the ground upon which he walked, and like the air he breathed. And on this night, a guest came to him whom he had not expected. It was Priam, the king of Troy, the father of Hector, a man with gray hair that was like silver, and with eyes that were full of tears, like the sky before a storm. He entered the tent, and his steps were as quiet as the steps of a ghost, and as light as the falling of leaves from a tree. He bore gifts, gold, silver, fabrics as thin as spider webs and as soft as down. He laid them before Achilles, and when he raised his eyes, his face was as pale as his hands, which trembled as he reached them toward Achilles. "I have come to beg you," he said, and his voice was as quiet as the whisper of the wind in dry grass, and as weak as the light that fades at sunset. "I have come to beg you to return to me the body of my son. I know that you have the right to revenge, that you have the right to anger, that you have the right to everything you have done. But I also know that you have the right to compassion, that you have the right to forgiveness, that you have the right to peace. I bring you these gifts, and I ask you, I beg you, I pray you, return to me the body of my son, so that I may bury him, so that I may mourn him, so that I may say goodbye to him." Achilles looked at him, and in his eyes there was no anger, no hatred, no cold, firm resolve that had been in them when he killed Hector. He looked at Priam, and he saw in him not an enemy, not a king, not the father of the one who had killed his friend. He saw in him only a man who had lost a son, a man who had suffered as he had suffered, a man who wanted only one thing, to say goodbye to the one he loved. He rose to his feet, and his hands, as he reached them toward Priam, were as warm as sunlight. "I will return to you the body of your son," he said, and his voice was as even as the surface of water on a windless day, and in it there was no fear, no doubt, only that silence that was like light that does not fade. "I will return to you the body of your son, because I know that you suffer as I suffer, and that your pain is as great as mine. I will return to you the body of your son, because I know that you want only one thing, to say goodbye to him, and that you have the right to do so. I will return to you the body of your son, because I know that this is right." He turned and walked to the entrance of the tent. He walked to Hector's body, which lay upon the ground, and his hands, when they touched it, were as gentle as the hands of a mother holding her child, and as strong as the hands of a father protecting his family. He lifted the body, and as he carried it toward Priam, his face was as calm as his heart, which seemed finally to have found peace. He gave the body to Priam, and when the old king received it, his hands, as they embraced his son's body, trembled like leaves in the wind, and his eyes, as he looked at him, were full of tears that flowed down his cheeks, like water that flows over stones. He did not speak, because words were not needed. He simply stood, embracing his son's body and letting his tears fall to the ground. The night was drawing to a close, and Achilles stood at the entrance of his tent, and the sky, which had been as black as his heart when he learned of Patroclus's death, was now beginning to lighten, like water that becomes clear after a stone has been dropped into it. He looked at the stars, which had already begun to fade, and at the moon, which had already begun to descend below the horizon, and his thoughts, as they raced through his mind, were of how his life had been so short and so bright, and how his death, which was as inevitable as the sunset, was already waiting for him. He knew this. He had always known it. Even when he was a boy, when he sat in Chiron's cave and listened to his stories of gods and heroes, he had known that his life would be short, that his death would be cruel, that his glory would be eternal. He felt no fear, no doubt, no cold, clinging anxiety that comes when you stand at the edge of a precipice and look down. He felt only peace, peace that was like light that penetrates through leaves, and like warmth that does not fade, and like hope that does not die, even when everything around is plunged into darkness. He turned and walked into his tent. In those times, when the gods still interfered in the affairs of mortals, there was no unity on Olympus. The Trojan War divided the heavenly beings into two camps, as a river divides the land into two banks, and each of the gods chose his side, guided not so much by justice as by personal grievances and affections. Hera and Athena, whose pride had been wounded by Paris when he did not give them the golden apple inscribed for the fairest, stood for the Greeks. Aphrodite, to whom Paris had given the victory, and Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, supported the Trojans. But if Aphrodite defended the city out of gratitude, Apollo had a reason far deeper and more personal. It was older than this war, and it appealed to the sense of revenge that he had carried in his heart for many years. And the name of this reason was Achilles. Long before the Greek ships reached the shores of Troy, long before Achilles became a legend, he had committed an act that brought upon him the wrath of the radiant god. When the Greek fleet stopped at the island of Tenedos on the way to Troy, Achilles met their Tense, the son of Apollo and a beautiful nymph. Tense was the king of the island, and he came to the shore to defend his land from strangers. Achilles, not yet knowing who stood before him, engaged him in combat and killed him. His mother, Thetis, who saw the future, had warned him, "Do not kill this man, my son. If you do, Apollo will take revenge on you. You will be killed by his arrow." But Achilles, blinded by his rage and thirst for glory, did not listen. And Apollo, who loved his son as only fathers can love, remembered this insult. He did not forget and did not forgive. He waited for his hour, as winter waits for the leaves to fall from the trees, and as night waits for the sun to disappear beyond the horizon. And that hour came. Apollo, who had already helped Hector kill Patroclus, protected Hector's body from desecration and guided the Trojans in battle, now decided to intervene personally. He could not kill Achilles himself, for the gods do not kill mortals directly unless they have committed unforgivable sacrilege. But he could use Paris as his instrument, the Trojan prince who, although a coward, possessed the art of archery. Paris, who had once on Mount Ida preferred Aphrodite's offer to obtain the love of beautiful Helen and rejected Athena's promises of wisdom and Hera's promises of power and might, was to become the instrument of divine vengeance. Paris himself did not know that his arrow was guided by a god. He stood at the Scaean gates, hiding behind a column, and his hands trembled as he drew the bowstring. He saw Achilles approaching the city, his armor gleaming in the sun, and it seemed that the god of war himself was marching on Troy. Paris was afraid, and in his heart was the same fear that had been there when he avoided battle with Menelaus at the beginning of the war. But Apollo gave him no choice. He stood behind him, invisible to mortals, and guided his hand. He chose his target, the heel of Achilles, the only place on the hero's body that the waters of the Styx had not touched. You remember that when Thetis, the mother of Achilles, learned that her son was destined to die young, she decided to cheat fate. She took the infant and went to the river Styx, which flows in the underworld, dividing the world of the living from the world of the dead. The waters of the Styx have the property of making those who dip in them invulnerable to weapons. She immersed him in the icy waters, holding him firmly by the left heel. The water burned, burning the mortality from his body, but the heel she held remained dry. This was the only place the water had not touched. Thus Achilles became almost invulnerable, but his heel remained his only weak spot. Thetis thought she was giving him eternal life, but she was mistaken. She gave him only the illusion of immortality. Only the gods knew the truth. Only they knew that his heel was his only weakness, the place where mortality hides beneath the veil of heroism. And Apollo, who saw everything, knew where to aim the arrow. He knew that if he struck that heel, he would destroy not merely a hero but a symbol of human pride that thinks it can rise above the gods. The arrow flew from the bowstring, and its flight was as swift as lightning and as inevitable as fate. It pierced the air and struck Achilles' heel, that very heel which his mother had held when she dipped him in the waters of the Styx. Achilles felt a blow like the bite of a serpent, and his legs gave way beneath him. He fell to the ground, and his body, which had been so strong and so invulnerable, suddenly became heavy as a stone that sinks in water. He lay on the dusty soil of a foreign land and looked at the sky, and his eyes, which had once burned with anger and vengeance, were now calm as the surface of water on a windless day. He knew that his death was inevitable, and he accepted it with the same dignity with which he accepted everything in his life. He did not think of pain, because pain was part of his life, and he had grown accustomed to it, as one grows accustomed to rain and wind. He did not think of fear, because fear was his enemy, and he had conquered it, as he had conquered all his enemies. He thought only of his life, which had been short but bright as a sunset that fades over the sea, leaving behind only light that does not die. He thought of Deidamia, of his son Neoptolemus, of how he would not see him grow, how he would not see him become a man, how he would not see him become who he was meant to be. He thought of his mother, who had gone into the sea, and of his father, who remained on the earth. He thought of his glory, which would live forever, and of his death, which was already waiting for him. But the death of Achilles did not bring silence to the Trojan land. On the contrary, around his body at the Scaean gates, a struggle erupted that lasted until sunset, when the sun, tired of watching, sank below the horizon, leaving behind only a crimson silence. The Trojans, driven by revenge for Hector and a lust for the priceless armor forged by Hephaestus himself, desperately tried to seize the body of the greatest of the Greek heroes. But the Greeks could not allow this to happen. And then two heroes, the two mightiest warriors remaining in the Greek camp, stood up to defend their fallen friend. Mighty Ajax, whose strength was second only to that of Achilles himself, lifted the hero's body, and it was as light as an autumn leaf, because the soul had already departed from it, and carried it to the ships through a hail of spears and arrows, through cries and groans, through that hell which men call war. And beside him, covering his retreat and holding back the Trojans, walked the cunning Odysseus, and his eyes, which had seen so many deaths, were moist as morning grass. Together they accomplished what seemed impossible. They carried Achilles' body out of the very thick of the enemy and returned it to the Greek camp, where it was met with silence and tears. Later, the hero's body was burned on a funeral pyre, and the flames, as they rose to the sky, were like light that does not fade, and his ashes, according to his last wish, were placed in a single urn with the ashes of his friend Patroclus. Thus ended the earthly journey of the greatest of the warriors of the Greek land. After the death of Achilles, when silence descended upon the camp and the last sparks of the pyre had died out, a question arose that was to divide those who remained. To whom should his armor rightfully belong, forged by the godsmith Hephaestus, which shone like starlight and was as warm as a mother's hands? Thetis herself, the mother of Achilles, rose from the sea's depths and commanded that it be given to the one who had most distinguished himself in defending the body of her son. The two main claimants were Ajax, who had carried the body from the battlefield, and Odysseus, who had covered his retreat. A dispute arose between them, like wind blowing from two directions, and like light that cannot choose where to burn. Odysseus, with his incomparable eloquence, which was as smooth as water, managed to convince the council of his rightness, and the armor was awarded to him. Ajax, who considered himself the only worthy heir to Achilles' glory, was deeply offended by this decision. He could not accept that his feat had not been appreciated, that his love for Achilles, which had been as strong as his strength, had no meaning. The humiliation proved unbearable for him, and he, his mind clouded, took his own life. Thus pride, which had been the cause of Achilles' death, also destroyed his faithful comrade, and their shadows, when they met in the underworld, perhaps embraced, because they were both victims of the same affliction, pride that gives no peace, even when you are already dead. And according to one of the most wondrous and poetic legends, on this white island, where the air was transparent as glass, and where birds sang songs that could not be sung on earth, Achilles found not only immortality, but also love. His eternal companion became Helen herself, the beautiful Helen, the very woman for whom the Trojan War had begun, whose face had launched 1,000 ships, and whose eyes had seen more deaths than any mortal. After her death, Helen, the fairest of mortal women, was transported to look, where she became the wife of Achilles. Their union was consecrated by the gods themselves. Thetis, the mother of Achilles, and Poseidon bore witness to this celestial wedding, and their voices, when they spoke the vows, were like the sound of the sea and like the sound of wind rustling leaves. There, on this paradise island, a son was born to them, whom they named Euphorion, and he was extraordinarily beautiful, with eyes that were like the sky, and with wings that could lift him above the clouds, and he, like his father, was marked with the seal of divine destiny. The mother of Achilles, Thetis, had tried so persistently to achieve his immortality in the literal sense. She wanted him to live forever, to never die, to be as immortal as the gods who sit on their thrones and look down upon the world from on high. She dipped him in the waters of the Styx. She held him over the fire. She rubbed ambrosia into his skin. She did everything to conquer death, as if death were an enemy that could be defeated by force. But she was mistaken. The immortality that fate gave to Achilles was of a different kind. And as long as the world exists, as long as people remember their legends, as long as the voices of poets are heard, Achilles will live. He will live in songs, in tales, in the hearts of those who hear his story and close their eyes to see him, the greatest of heroes, who fell but became immortal. His immortality was not in the body but in memory, not in flesh but in glory. And in this was his eternal life, his true immortality, his victory over death itself, which comes to all but cannot take what lives in the hearts of those who love.